had been wanting some time away from the city for a while. Life had become too noisy, too crowded. The idea of being alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, sounded like the perfect escape. My friend, Mark, had told me about a place his uncle owned, far off from any main roads. No neighbors, no cell service. Just a small, one-bedroom cabin with the bare essentials. It sounded perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The last hour was spent on a dirt road filled with potholes, my tires crunching over loose gravel. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun had started dipping behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows. The place was small but sturdy. A single front porch with a rocking chair, a chimney on one side, and a stack of firewood beside the door. It looked exactly like the kind of place where a person could forget the rest of the world existed. The first thing I noticed after stepping inside was the smell of wood. Not just from the walls and floors, but from years of fires burned in the stone fireplace. The furniture was old but solid wooden chairs, a small kitchen table, a couch that looked like it had been sat in for decades. The kitchen had the basics: a gas stove, a fridge that ran on a generator, a sink with a hand pump for water. A single bedroom sat at the back with a small bed and a dresser. Everything was simple, practical. Felt like stepping into the past. I spent the first night getting settled, lighting a fire, and reading. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first. I was used to city noise, sirens, car horns, people talking. Out here, the only sounds were the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It took a while to adjust, but by the time I went to bed, I felt a deep sense of calm. No responsibilities, no emails, no notifications. Just me and the silence. That changed on the second night. I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on fallen leaves. My first thought was animals, deer maybe, but as I lay there, holding my breath, I heard it again. A single, deliberate step, then another. Not an animal. Someone was outside. I sat up slowly, listening. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The sound of footsteps moved, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it could be a hiker, someone who got lost. But I knew that was unlikely. The cabin was too far from any trails. No one should be out here. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the wooden door. I stayed still, listening. For a long time, there was nothing, just the wind through the trees. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting. The doorknob didn't move. No knocks, just the sound of someone standing there. Then, after a while, the footsteps moved again. This time, away from the cabin. I didn't move until I could no longer hear them. I barely slept that night. Every sound made my body tense. I told myself it was just some hunter passing through, maybe stopping to check the cabin. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. A hunter wouldn't just stand outside, listening. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and sure enough, there were footprints leading around the cabin. They were deep, made by heavy boots. They circled the place more than once, stopping right at the door. But what disturbed me most was that there were no footprints leading away, just the ones that circled, as if whoever it was had just vanished. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the area, looking for any sign of someone camping nearby. Nothing, just endless trees and silence. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the footprints were older than I thought, made by Mark's uncle or some other visitor. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. That night, I locked the door and kept the fire burning high. I sat on the couch with my flashlight close, listening. Hours passed and nothing happened, just the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire. Eventually, I started to relax, convincing myself I had overreacted. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A slow, careful step outside the window. My breath caught in my throat. The window was to my left, covered by an old, thin curtain. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate. Then they stopped right outside the glass. I didn't dare turn my head. I knew, deep in my bones, that if I looked, I would see someone standing there, watching me. The fire crackled. The wind blew. I counted the seconds in my head, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was only silence. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps moved again, circling the cabin once more before fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right. I packed my bag, loaded the car, and took one last look at the cabin. The footprints were back, fresh in the dirt. But again, no sign of them leading away. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started driving. The dirt road stretched ahead, rough and winding. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. It took over an hour to reach the main road. As soon as I had service, I called Mark. I told him everything, the footsteps, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. He was silent for a long time before finally saying, "My uncle hasn't been up there in years." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. I haven't gone back. I don't plan to. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some lost hiker. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to find out. I don't know why I agreed to watch my uncle's cabin for the weekend. He made it sound easy, just check the place out, make sure no animals get in, and keep the generator running in case the power flickers. He even left food stocked up so I wouldn't have to bring much. "Just relax," he told me. "It's quiet up there, peaceful." I should have known better. The drive took longer than expected. The road twisted up the mountain, lined with tall trees that blocked out most of the late afternoon light. I barely had cell service. By the time I pulled into the clearing, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge. The cabin stood there, small and solid, with its dark wood siding and a wide front porch. It looked exactly like I remembered from when I was a kid. The first thing I noticed was how silent it was. No wind, no birds, no rustling in the trees, just my car's engine ticking as it cooled. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic: a worn couch, a wooden dining table, a narrow bed in the only bedroom. The kitchen was stocked like he said, mostly canned food and some bottled water. There was a fireplace, but I had no plans to use it. The power was still on, though the lights flickered once when I flipped the switch. I set my bag down in the bedroom and checked my phone. Barely any signal. One bar, sometimes two, but nothing strong enough to load a page. That was fine. I just needed a quiet weekend. I'd read, maybe go for a short hike, and head home Sunday afternoon. That first night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Every tiny sound, settling wood, the wind outside, my own breathing, felt too loud. I told myself it was just the quiet playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a noise outside. A soft crunch, like footsteps in the snow, except there wasn't any snow, just dry leaves and dirt. My heart pounded as I listened. Another step, then nothing. I sat up, ears straining. It was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't bring myself to check. After a few minutes of silence, I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The dirt driveway was empty except for my car. No tracks, nothing out of place. Maybe I imagined it. I spent most of the day inside, reading, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. Around noon, I heard a thump from the other side of the cabin, like something knocking against the wall. I set my book down and walked to the window, but I didn't see anything. It happened again that evening. A solid, deliberate knock, like someone tapping on the wood with their knuckles. I checked the windows again. Nothing. I stayed inside the rest of the night, lights on, watching the windows. Around midnight, I finally went to bed, though I didn't expect to sleep much. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks. Slow, steady. I sat up, my pulse hammering. It was closer this time, not on the far wall, but near the front door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. No footsteps, no rustling, just the quiet, waiting. I told myself it had to be a tree branch shifting in the wind, even though the air was still. I waited, then a scrape, like nails dragging across wood. My body locked up, came from just outside the front door. The porch. I wanted to move, to grab something, but I couldn't. My hands were clammy. My throat was dry. I waited, heart pounding, until finally, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I forced myself to check the porch. My hands shook as I unlatched the door and pushed it open. Nothing, but then I saw them. Long, deep scratches in the wood, just beside the door frame. Fresh. I stepped back inside and locked the door. My brain scrambled for an explanation, but none of them made sense. A bear? Maybe, but bears don't knock. I needed to leave. I packed my bag, threw everything into my car, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I checked my phone. No signal. The one bar I had before was gone. Panic clawed up my throat. I took a deep breath, trying to think. There was an old trail that led down the mountain about 5 miles. It would take time, but I could walk back to town. I grabbed my flashlight and a knife from the kitchen, just in case. Then I stepped outside. The forest felt different. The air was thick, pressing against me. The trees stood too still, like they were waiting. I took a few steps toward the trail and stopped. Something was wrong. The woods had never been completely silent. Even last night, I could hear the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. But now, nothing. Then ahead of me, deep in the trees, a figure, standing still, too still. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape between the trees. My breath caught. I didn't move. Neither did it. I took a slow step back. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, watching. I turned and walked back to the cabin, forcing myself not to run. I shut the door, locked it, and pulled the curtains tight. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside, watching, waiting. Night fell and the silence grew heavier. My fingers gripped the knife as I sat at the table, listening. Then, a knock. 3 slow knocks. This time, I didn't freeze. I grabbed my bag, yanked the door open, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I saw the first light of a house in the distance. By the time I reached the road, I was shaking. A passing truck stopped and the driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, rolled down the window. "You all right?" he asked. I looked back at the trees, half expecting to see something standing there. Watching. Nothing. "I just need a ride," I said. He nodded and I climbed in. As we drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the dark road behind us. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what was out there. I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods, but after everything that had happened over the past year, I needed the silence. The cabin was old, tucked deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town. It had been in my family for decades, though no one had used it in years. It seemed like the perfect place to clear my mind. Getting there was a nightmare. The road was little more than a dirt path, winding up through the trees with barely enough room for my truck. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and more than once, I felt the tires slipping, the edge of the road far too close for comfort. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I could barely see it through the thick forest that surrounded it. The place looked worse than I remembered. The wood was gray and worn, the windows streaked with dirt. The front steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them, fumbling with the old key before finally shoving the door open. Dust filled the air. The smell of damp wood and age clung to everything. Inside, the layout was simple. A single room with a kitchen area in the back, a fireplace against the far wall, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. The furniture was covered in sheets, but everything seemed intact. I dumped my bag on the table and turned on the generator outside. The lights flickered weakly but held. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Every noise felt louder in the silence. At some point, I thought I heard something moving outside, a soft crunch of leaves. But when I shone my flashlight through the window, all I saw was darkness. The next day, I explored a little. The trees were dense, the ground uneven. I followed a narrow trail that led down toward a creek. The air was cool, the water clear. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Small piles of stones, stacked carefully in little towers. Some were just a few inches tall, others nearly a foot. I didn't remember them being there when I was a kid. I pushed one over with my boot, watching the stones scatter, then turned back toward the cabin. That night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin was deep in the woods, too far for anyone to just stumble upon it. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, pressing my face to the glass. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was damp from the rain, and I could see footprints leading from the woods to my window. They weren't mine. I spent the day keeping busy, trying to shake the unease. I chopped wood, cleaned up inside, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as the sun dipped below the trees, that feeling crept back in, the sense that I wasn't alone. That night, the noises started earlier, a soft scraping sound against the wall. I sat by the fireplace, staring at the door. The generator hummed, the flames flickered, but the sound continued. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The forest was silent, too silent. I swept the light across the trees. Something moved, just a flicker of motion, gone before I could focus. My chest tightened. I stepped back inside, locking the door. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of the doorknob rattling. Someone was trying to get in. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the rifle from the corner and crept toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knob twisted hard, then stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, my fingers gripping the gun so tightly they ached. Finally, I forced myself to move, peering through the peephole. Nothing. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of stones, stacked neatly on the porch. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things. I didn't care if I had planned to stay a week. I wasn't spending another night there. I threw my bag into the truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. My hands shook as I tried again, pumping the gas. Still nothing. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. For all I knew, something had been tampered with. The thought made my skin crawl. I had no choice. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The road was miles long, but I'd rather take my chances with the wilderness than stay another second in that cabin. The forest seemed different as I walked, quieter, heavier. Then I saw them, more stone piles, lining the road, dozens of them, each one carefully placed, stretching out ahead of me like a path. I kept walking, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. It took hours, but I finally reached the main road. A truck was passing, and I waved it down, barely able to get the words out as I asked for a ride. The driver eyed me but nodded, and I climbed in, not daring to look back at the trail behind me. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of that cabin, of the stones, of the feeling that someone was watching. And when I wake up, for just a second, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window. I remember the cold bite of the mountain air when I first arrived at the cabin. It was late October, and the trees were nearly bare, their skeletal branches stretching toward a dull gray sky. The drive had been long, winding through miles of desolate forest roads, the kind that made you feel completely alone in the world. I had rented the cabin for a week. It was meant to be a break, a chance to get away from everything. Work had been suffocating me. City life was draining, and I just wanted to be somewhere quiet. The pictures online had made it seem cozy. A rustic wooden structure nestled deep in the woods, far from anyone or anything. That was exactly what I wanted. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed how cold it was. Not just a normal kind of cold, but something deeper, something that seeped into my bones. I turned on the fireplace first thing, hoping to chase away the chill. The interior was simple, just like I expected. Wood-paneled walls, a single couch near the fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom down the short hall. No TV, no internet, no distractions. Just peace and quiet. I unpacked slowly, taking my time settling in. The silence was almost too thick, pressing in on me like a weight. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the cabin and the wind outside. I told myself I just wasn't used to the quiet, that the absence of city noise made the silence feel unnatural. That first night, I slept uneasily. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a faint rustling, the distant snap of a twig. Normal sounds in the middle of the woods, but they set my nerves on edge. I reminded myself that animals roamed these forests, that I wasn't the only living thing out here. The second day, I explored the surrounding woods. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, with thick trees stretching out in every direction. I followed an old, overgrown trail that led deeper into the forest. The air smelled damp, the ground soft beneath my boots. I saw signs of wildlife, deer tracks, a few claw marks on trees, possibly from a bear, but nothing out of the ordinary. By the third day, something felt off. I couldn't explain it. It was a sensation, a nagging awareness that I wasn't alone. It started with small things. Finding my backpack slightly open when I knew I had zipped it shut. The feeling of being watched whenever I stepped outside. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I heard footsteps. Not the quick, erratic movement of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps just beyond the clearing. I turned off the lamp, letting the fire be my only source of light. I listened carefully, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin at a distance. I couldn't see anything through the dark windows, only my own reflection staring back at me. After a while, the footsteps faded. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I locked the door anyway before going to bed. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside, human footprints, barefoot. The prints were uneven, dragging in some places. They led from the edge of the trees, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the forest. I felt a wave of unease settle in my stomach. Someone had been out there, watching. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was probably just some hiker, maybe even a local messing around. I wasn't going to let paranoia ruin my trip. I spent the day inside, reading, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut. The daylight made things feel normal again. But as soon as the sun set, the unease returned. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind made me tense up. Then, sometime around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they came right up to the cabin. I lay frozen in my bed, listening as someone, or something, moved just outside. My breath caught as I heard the doorknob rattle. Slow testing. The lock held. I reached for the knife I had brought with me, gripping it tightly. The rattling stopped, replaced by a long silence. Then, a soft scratching sound against the wooden walls. It moved around the cabin, like fingers dragging against the surface. My throat went dry, then a single knock on the door. Soft, almost polite. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again. Then, nothing. Silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, gripping the knife, listening to the silence stretch on. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have dozed off at some point. When I woke up, it was morning, and everything was still. Too still. I cautiously stepped outside. The footprints were back, more of them this time. They led from the forest to my door and then back again. But what made my stomach drop was the writing carved into the wooden door. Let me. I packed my things in under 5 minutes. I didn't care about the rental agreement, didn't care about losing money. I needed to leave. As I threw my bag into the truck, I glanced back at the tree line. Someone was standing there, figure thin, pale, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I didn't stay to look. I jumped into the truck, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back until I was miles away. I never reported it, never told anyone. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, when I hear something outside my apartment, something soft, something slow, I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I never thought much about staying in a cabin alone. It wasn't something I feared, and it wasn't something I had any real experience with either. It was just a cabin, a structure made of wood, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. That was all it was to me when I first arrived. But by the time I left, I knew better. I had rented the cabin for a week. I needed a break from everything: work, people, noise. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees and silence sounded perfect. I found the place online, read a few reviews, and booked it without much thought. The listing described it as an off-the-grid retreat, which at the time seemed like a bonus. No cell service, no internet, just peace and quiet. That was what I wanted. The drive out there was long. The last stretch of road wasn't even paved, just a narrow dirt path winding through thick woods. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't just happen to pass by. You had to be going there on purpose. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small, but sturdy looking. Dark wood, a steeply pitched roof, a wraparound porch. It had a single front door with a heavy iron handle, and a couple of windows that stared out into the forest like dead eyes. A thick stack of firewood was piled against the side of the building, and there was an old axe embedded in a chopping block nearby. The inside was just as simple. One main room with a bed, a fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a door that led to a cramped bathroom. There was no television, no radio, just an old bookshelf filled with dusty paperbacks. The whole place smelled like wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. It was fine, quiet, exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup on the gas stove, read a few chapters of an old mystery novel, and went to bed early. The silence was almost overwhelming, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of silence you didn't get in the city, where there was always the distant hum of traffic or the buzz of electricity. Here, there was nothing but the occasional creak of wood and the whisper of wind through the trees. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was chopping wood in the late afternoon, getting a pile ready for the evening, when I noticed something strange. The axe was different. I could have sworn the handle had a small crack near the base when I first arrived, but now it was smooth, new, like it had been replaced. I told myself I was imagining things, just a trick of memory. Maybe I hadn't looked at it as closely as I thought. That night, I woke up to a sound outside, a single sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. The sound didn't come again. I lay back down but didn't sleep well after that. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump, and I kept straining my ears for another sound outside, but nothing came. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the clearing, just to ease my nerves. The woods were dense, the ground covered in a thick carpet of dead leaves. I wandered a little, sticking close enough to see the cabin through the trees. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. I could tell because they were deeper, heavier, bigger than my boots. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, stopped near the porch, then turned back into the woods. I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. Someone had been here, watching, standing just outside while I slept. I went inside, locked the door, and checked every window. They were all closed, secure. I told myself it could have been an old set of tracks, maybe left by the last person who rented the place. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. I sat in bed, listening, waiting. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A single footstep. This time it was close, right outside the front door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes stayed locked on the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. Another step. Slow, deliberate. I reached for the axe. The handle was smooth beneath my fingers, solid. The only thing between me and whatever was out there. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the axe, staring at the door. The fire crackled. The wind moaned through the trees, but no other sound came. By the time morning came, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things in a rush, shoving everything into my bag. As I stepped outside, I forced myself to look around. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still, nothing moving between them. But when I turned toward my car, my breath caught in my throat. Every tire was slashed, deep, deliberate gashes. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Someone had done this. Someone had been out here, moving around while I slept, and they had made sure I couldn't leave. A sound came from the woods, a rustling, faint but unmistakable. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced. No cell service, no way to call for help, no way to drive out of here. The nearest town was miles away, too far to walk before nightfall. I checked the firewood pile. There was enough to last another night, maybe two. I had food, water. If I had to wait until someone came looking for me, I could. I had no choice. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, axe in hand, every muscle tense. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin, stopping just outside the door. But this time I didn't wait. I threw the door open, axe raised, ready to fight. But there was no one there, only the empty clearing, the dark trees, the cold night air pressing in from all sides. But the footprints were there, fresh, leading from the woods right up to the door where I stood. And then, nothing. No prints leading away. Whoever it was, they were still here. I shut the door and waited for dawn. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I left. I ran, didn't stop, didn't look back. I walked for hours until I found a road. A truck passed eventually and I flagged it down. I never went back for my car. I never told anyone the full story. But sometimes late at night I think about that cabin, about the footprints, about the axe that was replaced before I even noticed. And I wonder if whoever was out there that night is still waiting. I remember everything about that night, every sound, every feeling, the way the cold air seemed thicker inside than out, the way the wind pressed itself against the windows like it wanted in, the way my own breathing sounded too loud, like something else might be listening. I had rented the cabin for the weekend. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to be alone, to clear my head. Work had been stressful and I was tired of the city. The cabin was small, old, deep in the woods, but I didn't mind. I wanted the quiet. I arrived just before dark. The drive was long, twisting through miles of empty road, the trees pressing close on both sides. I hadn't seen another car for nearly an hour by the time I pulled up to the cabin. There was no driveway, just a dirt path leading up to a clearing. The cabin itself looked abandoned. Weathered wood, sagging roof, a front porch that seemed to lean to one side. But the inside was clean enough. Simple. A fireplace, a couch, a small kitchen. A single bedroom with an old wooden bed. The mattress was thin, the blankets smelled like dust, but I wasn't planning on sleeping much anyway. Just reading, hiking, breathing in the quiet. It wasn't until I went back outside to grab my bags that I noticed something was off. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds, just thick, pressing silence. Felt wrong, but I shook it off. I was alone in the woods, that was the whole point. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and built a fire. The warmth helped. I made a quick dinner, ate by the fire, and tried to settle in. But the quiet stuck to me. I kept thinking I heard something. A creak, a shuffle, the wind pushing against the cabin. I told myself it was nothing, just an old building settling. Then I heard it. Not a creak, not the wind, something outside. Footsteps, slow, steady, moving through the trees behind the cabin. I froze, listened. The fire crackled, the wood popped, but underneath it, I could hear them, closer now. A crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless. But then it stopped, right outside. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the front door, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed. The fire burned lower. I told myself I imagined it. I had to be on edge from the isolation, from the silence. I forced myself to stand, to go to the window. I pulled the curtain back just an inch. Enough to see. Darkness. Trees. Nothing else. I turned back to the fire, but something made me look again. This time, I didn't just glance. I scanned. My eyes adjusted, and that's when I saw it. Not a shape, not a figure, a handprint, pressed against the outside of the window, smudged, uneven, like someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over the coffee table. My pulse hammered. I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course. I locked the doors, checked the windows, grabbed the fire poker and stood in the middle of the room, listening. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. That heavy silence, thick and unnatural, wrapped itself around the cabin like a second set of walls. I didn't sit down, didn't sleep, just stood there waiting. Hours passed. The fire died. The air turned cold. My eyes burned from staring at the door, but I didn't hear anything else, didn't see anything else. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay down on the couch, the fire poker still clutched in my hand, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept, maybe an hour, maybe less, but I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine, close, right next to me. I shot up, swung the poker blindly, but there was nothing, just empty air. The door was still locked, the windows still shut, but the handprint was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-sleep, every creak making my pulse jump. By morning, the woods felt normal again. Birds chirped, the wind moved, but I didn't feel normal. I packed my bags and left without eating, without cleaning. I didn't even check out. I just drove, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what happened that night. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for sure. I was not alone in that cabin. I never liked being alone in the woods. Something about the stillness felt unnatural. It wasn't the quiet that got to me, not the absence of city noise or the lack of distant traffic hum. It was the way the silence pressed in, thick and heavy, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something. The cabin was old. I rented it for a week to get away, to clear my head. Work had been a mess. Life had been a mess, and I just wanted some peace. It wasn't fancy, just a single-story wooden place tucked between thick pines, far from town. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away, and I liked that. At least I thought I did. The first 2 days were uneventful. I fished in the lake, read on the porch, drank beer, and let my mind unwind. I wasn't used to the quiet, but I started to enjoy it. That changed on the 3rd night. I went to bed early. The fireplace crackled softly, and the wind outside rustled through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but I woke up sometime past midnight, feeling off. Not like a bad dream or a creaky floorboard unsettling me. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. Nothing was out of place. The small wooden table still held my book and empty beer bottle. My backpack sat half-zipped near the door, and the window showed nothing but blackness outside. Still, my skin prickled. I tried to shake it off, convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But when I reached for the lamp switch, I hesitated. Something felt different. The room smelled different. Not musty wood or old furniture, but something faint, like sweat and earth, like someone had been inside. I checked the front door, locked, checked the windows, locked. The only way in or out was through that door. and I knew for a fact I had bolted it before bed. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the woods outside. Every crack of a branch, every shift of the wind made my heart race. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were uneasy. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just paranoid and used to the silence. I spent the day hiking, trying to tire myself out. But when I came back, I noticed something strange. My backpack wasn't where I left it. It had been near the door, half-zipped. Now it sat in the middle of the floor, fully open. I told myself I had just forgotten moving it. Maybe I had. Maybe I was overthinking. But then I saw my jacket. I had draped it over a chair the night before, but now it was hanging on a hook near the door. I didn't remember moving it. That night, I locked the door tighter. I jammed a chair under the handle, something I hadn't done since I was a kid afraid of monsters under the bed. But monsters weren't real. People were. Sleep didn't come at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside, a soft rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, listening. The sound came closer. It wasn't an animal. Animals move with quick steps, scurry, or snap twigs as they go. This was slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound stopped right outside the cabin. I wanted to look out the window, but my body refused to move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I wasn't there. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something near the porch. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopped at the windows, then the door. I packed my bag. I didn't care how much time I had left in that cabin. I wasn't staying another night. By noon, I was in my car, driving back to town, heart still pounding. I never found out who it was. Never found out what they wanted. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone in those woods. Someone else was out there, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever be the same after what happened in that cabin. Even now, months later, I wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, my ears straining for sounds that shouldn't be there. I tell myself I'm safe, that I'm far away from that place, but my body refuses to believe it. I don't think it ever will. Started as a simple trip, just a weekend away to clear my head. Life had been wearing me down, and I needed to escape the noise, the constant hum of the city, the pressure of work. I had found the cabin online. It was in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep into a forest, exactly what I was looking for. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell service, just me and the quiet. The drive up there was uneventful. It took me nearly 6 hours, most of it winding through back roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper into the forest I went. The last stretch wasn't even paved, just a dirt road riddled with potholes and lined with trees so thick they blocked out the sun. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sky was starting to dim, the air turning cold. The cabin itself was nothing special. A single-story structure with a slanted roof, old wooden siding, and a porch that looked like it had seen better days. It had been advertised as rustic, which I had expected, but seeing it in person made me hesitate. The place looked abandoned. The windows were covered in grime. The front door had deep scratches in the wood, and the whole structure seemed to lean ever so slightly to one side. Still, I had driven all this way, and I wasn't about to turn back. I grabbed my bag, walked up the creaking steps, and pushed the door open. The inside wasn't much better. Dust coated every surface, the air was stale, and the furniture looked like it had been sitting untouched for decades. The only light came from the fading sun through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I set my bag down and checked my phone. No service. I had expected that, but it still made me uneasy. I reminded myself that this was what I wanted: peace, solitude. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I explored the cabin, checking each room. There was a small kitchen with an old stove, a fridge that barely worked, and cabinets filled with dust-covered dishes. The bathroom was tiny, with a sink that dripped constantly. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a wooden dresser. But what struck me as odd was the second room. It was empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare wooden floors and walls. And the door had a lock on the outside. I tried not to think about it. Maybe the previous owner had used it for storage. Maybe it had just been a weird design choice. Either way, it wasn't my concern. I made a small dinner from the supplies I had brought, lit a couple of candles since the cabin's lighting was dim at best, and settled in for the night. It was quiet, too quiet. No cars in the distance, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft, steady tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the cabin. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside, from the empty room. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and slowly got out of bed. My feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor as I moved toward the door. The tapping stopped. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to go back to bed, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. Nothing. The room was empty just like before. The only sound was my own breathing, loud and uneven in the silence. I shone the flashlight around, checking the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There was nothing there. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. The next day, I thought about leaving. Something about the cabin made my skin crawl. But I had paid for the weekend, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin my trip. I spent the day outside, hiking through the woods, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me. But that night, it happened again. The tapping, soft, steady, coming from the locked room. This time, I didn't move. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body frozen. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, then stopped all at once. Silence filled the cabin, and then I heard something worse. Breathing, deep, slow, right outside my bedroom door. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bag, threw it into the car, and sped out of there, dirt and gravel flying behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what was in that cabin. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear the tapping. And I know deep down that whatever was in there, it hasn't forgotten me. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. I had left the city late in the afternoon, expecting to make it there before sundown, but the winding roads through the forest slowed me down. By the time I arrived, the last traces of sunlight had disappeared behind the mountains. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by thick trees, with a small clearing in front where my truck now sat, engine ticking as it cooled. I killed the headlights and sat in the truck for a moment, listening. Nothing but the hum of insects and the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. No other cars, no distant lights, no signs of life. That was the point, though. I had come out here to be alone, to get away from everything for a few days. Grabbing my bag from the passenger seat, I stepped out into the cold night air. The cabin wasn't big. One floor, a steeply pitched roof, a small porch with 2 wooden chairs. I found the key under the mat just like the owner had said it would be. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. A single overhead light barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows against the walls. There was a couch against one side, a small kitchen area, and a door leading to what I assumed was the bedroom. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, cold and dark. The place looked clean enough, though it had the feel of something that hadn't been lived in for a while. I dropped my bag onto the couch and walked around, getting a feel for the place. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a dresser. A single window looked out into the trees. I checked the bathroom, turned on the sink to make sure the water worked. Came out rusty at first, then ran clear. Back in the main room, I found a stack of firewood near the stove and decided to get a fire going. It took a few tries, but soon enough, the flames caught, crackling as they spread through the dry wood. The warmth helped push back the cold that had settled into the cabin. I sat on the couch, staring into the fire. I had brought books, a notebook, even some work I needed to catch up on. But for now, I just wanted to sit and listen to the quiet. No traffic, no voices, no phones ringing. Just the sound of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. At some point, I dozed off. I'm not sure how long I slept, but something woke me. A sound. The thud from outside. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding. I sat up, listening. The fire had burned lower, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Another sound. A scraping noise like something moving against the porch. I stayed still, straining to hear. Could have been an animal, a raccoon, or a deer wandering close. But something about the sound made me uneasy. It had weight to it, like something heavier than a small animal. Slowly, I got up and moved toward the window. The glass was dark, reflecting the glow of the fire. I couldn't see outside. Reaching for my flashlight, I clicked it on and aimed it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty porch. Nothing. I exhaled, feeling a little stupid for getting worked up. I turned away from the window, but then, a sharp knock. 3 knocks, hard and deliberate. I froze. The cabin was supposed to be empty. There was no one else out here. The nearest town was miles away. I hadn't passed another car on the way up. My breath felt loud in my ears. I swallowed and took a slow step toward the door. Another knock, harder this time. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, heart hammering. Then the doorknob rattled. I took a step back. My first thought was to grab my phone, but I already knew there was no signal out here. My second thought was the gun in my bag. I never traveled without it. Slowly, I reached for it, keeping my eyes on the door. Silence. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore, but they were still there. I could feel it. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. My fingers tightened around the grip of the gun. Then soft footsteps, moving away. I let out a slow breath. I moved to the window again, trying to see, but the trees swallowed the darkness. I waited another 10 minutes before I moved. I didn't want to turn the lights off, but I didn't want to leave them on either. I compromised by keeping the fire going and sitting in the darkest corner of the room, watching the door. I didn't sleep. Not that night. Morning came slow. The cabin felt different in the daylight, less threatening. I stepped outside, gun in hand, and walked around the porch. The ground was damp from the night's cold, and in the dirt near the steps, I saw them. Footprints. Large, deep prints leading up to the door. But here's the thing, there were no prints leading away. Whoever had knocked, whoever had stood there in the dark, had either vanished into thin air or was still out there, watching. I packed my things. I left, and I never went back. I rented the cabin because I needed time away. Work had been relentless, my apartment felt suffocating, and I just wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people. I found the listing online, an old but well-maintained cabin deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest town. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, and nothing but trees in every direction. The drive up took nearly 2 hours. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, winding deeper into the forest until I reached a clearing where the cabin stood. It was a single-story structure, dark wood with a tin roof. A small porch wrapped around the front, and to the side there was an old shed. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The owner had left the key under a rock by the door, just as they had said they would. I stepped inside. The interior was simple but cozy. A couch, a fireplace, A tiny kitchen with an old gas stove, a single bedroom and a bathroom in the back. There was no TV, just a stack of books on a shelf and a few oil lamps in case the power went out. It was exactly what I needed. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, sat on the porch, and listened to the forest settle into darkness. I expected silence, but the woods were alive with sounds. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was calming in a way. I slept well. The next morning, I took a walk through the woods, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The trees were dense, the air cool. I walked for about an hour before turning back. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it. I stepped inside cautiously. Everything looked the same. My bag was where I left it, my jacket still draped over the couch. Nothing was missing. Maybe the wind had pushed the door open? I locked it this time, making sure it was shut tight. That night, I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. Someone was outside. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My mind raced. Could have been an animal, but the steps were too controlled, too human. I lay there, listening, my breathing shallow. The footsteps stopped, and for a long time, there was nothing but silence. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the isolation was messing with my head. But that afternoon, I found something. About 20 yards from the cabin, near the tree line, there was a cigarette butt on the ground. It wasn't mine. Someone had been here. I tried to shake it off. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe the owner had stopped by. There were plenty of explanations, none of them sinister. But I kept my guard up. I locked the door again that night, checking it twice. I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of wind against the cabin walls made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about the footsteps, about the cigarette. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I didn't believe that. The next day, I decided to leave early. I packed my bag, loaded up my car, and got ready to go. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything looked fine. Panic crept in. I was stranded. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and I had no way to call for help. I considered walking, but the idea of trekking through miles of dense forest alone made my stomach turn. I told myself I'd try again in the morning. Maybe the car would start after it sat for a while. That night, the footsteps came back. They were closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, gripping a kitchen knife. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then a sound, faint but unmistakable. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The knob rattled again. Then silence. Minutes passed, dragging like hours. I don't know how long I sat there before exhaustion took over. I woke up at first light, still clutching the knife. The door was locked, just as I had left it. But something was different. On the porch, in the dirt, were footprints. Fresh ones. I wasn't imagining this. Someone had been outside trying to get in. I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The road was long, and I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling exposed, vulnerable. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, more suffocating. Every sound made me jump. After hours of walking, I reached the highway. A truck driver picked me up, took me to town. I called a tow truck to get my car. When they brought it in, the mechanic told me something that made my stomach drop. Someone had cut the wires under the hood. Someone had wanted me to stay. I should have never gone to that cabin alone. The plan was simple. A week away from the noise, the stress, and the exhaustion of city life. My job had drained me, and I needed quiet, real, absolute quiet. So, I booked a remote cabin deep in the woods, miles from any town. No neighbors, no distractions. Just me, nature, and a chance to reset. The drive was long and winding, the roads narrowing as the trees thickened. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of dark, weathered logs with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. It looked old, but well-maintained, like someone had cared for it once but hadn't lived in it for years. Inside was basic, just a kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. The furniture was heavy and wooden, the kind that lasts decades. A thick layer of dust coated the bookshelves, and the air smelled faintly of pine and old wood. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, barely any phone signal. Exactly what I wanted. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner, sat on the porch listening to the wind rustling through the trees, and then went to bed early. But I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal. I've spent enough time hiking to know what raccoons and deer sound like. This was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I reached for my phone, but of course no signal. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, staring at the bedroom door. The steps eventually faded into the woods. Morning came and I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe a deer, maybe my own paranoia. But when I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were fresh, deep, and unmistakably human. I checked the cabin. The doors were still locked, windows secure. Nothing was missing or disturbed. But the fact that someone had been out there, circling the cabin in the middle of the night, made my skin crawl. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. Hiked a bit, chopped some wood, tried to distract myself. But that night, it happened again. This time I stayed awake, waiting. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned. Slow, steady, crunching over the dirt and leaves. They stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Then, a soft scrape against the window pane. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, then silence. When the sun rose, I checked the window. There were faint streaks on the glass, like someone had run their fingers down it. My stomach twisted. I had to get out of there. I packed my things in a frenzy and loaded the car. But when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. Battery dead. That made no sense. I had driven in just 2 days ago with no issue. I popped the hood, but I had no idea what I was looking for. That's when I saw it. The hood latch had been tampered with. The wires underneath looked cut. Someone had done this. While I was sleeping, panic set in. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The nearest town was about 15 miles away, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to a road, find someone. Anyone. I barely made it a mile before I heard the footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was nothing, just trees and silence. I started walking faster, then running. The footsteps behind me kept pace. I wasn't alone. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road. A truck was coming. I ran straight into its path, waving my arms like a madman. The driver, a middle-aged guy with a concerned face, pulled over immediately. I told him everything. He drove me straight to the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy back to the cabin, but by the time they got there, whoever had been out there was gone. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. They towed my car, fixed the wires, and told me I was lucky. Could have been some drifter messing with you, the deputy said. Or maybe you just spooked yourself out. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I never went back to that cabin, never even looked up who owned it. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear footsteps outside my window, I wonder if I was ever really alone out there. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a week alone in a small cabin, far from the noise of the city. I had been stressed for months, work, bills, life in general. The idea of a remote retreat, just me and nature, seemed perfect. A friend had told me about a place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. He had stayed there once and swore it was peaceful. The drive took most of the day. By the time I reached the last stretch, a narrow dirt road winding through thick trees, the sun was already setting. The forest was dense, the kind that seemed untouched. No signs, no other houses, just trees pressing in from both sides. I had downloaded a map beforehand since there was no cell service this far out. The cabin itself was simple, a single-story structure made of old, weathered logs. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under a loose rock by the door. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. There was a main living space with a couch, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a single bed. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, the only source of heat. I unpacked quickly. I had brought enough food and supplies to last the week. The plan was to disconnect completely, no phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and silence. I set up a small fire in the stove and sat back, letting the warmth fill the room. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're truly exhausted. In the morning, I made coffee and stepped outside. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no sign of human activity, no power lines, no roads beyond the one I had driven in on. Just nature. It was beautiful in a way that also felt a little unsettling. I spent the day exploring. There was a narrow path leading deeper into the woods, so I followed it. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. Probably just squirrels or deer. After about an hour of walking, I came across something odd. A rusted-out truck, half sunken into the earth. It had clearly been there for years. The windows were shattered, and moss covered most of the body. I peeked inside. The seats were torn, the dashboard cracked. There were no signs of who had left it there. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the trees. I started a fire, made dinner, and sat in the quiet. The silence was heavier now, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every small noise. A branch snapping outside, the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The second night, I woke up to a sound. A faint scraping against the cabin wall. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox. I sat up, listening. The sound stopped. Then, a moment later, it came again. A slow, deliberate scraping. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing. Just darkness and the reflection of my own face. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe a branch brushing against the wood. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I checked the cabin walls. There were no branches close enough to scrape against them. But near the back of the cabin, in the soft earth, I saw footprints. Not boots or shoes, bare feet. The prints were fresh. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Maybe someone had gotten lost. But why would they be barefoot? I decided not to think about it. I spent the day fishing at a nearby creek, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. That night, the scraping came again. Louder this time, closer. It moved along the wall, slow and steady. I sat in bed, heart pounding. Then something knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, listening. The door didn't open. The knocks didn't come again. But I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag. When I stepped outside, the air felt wrong. Heavy, silent. The footprints from the day before were still there, but now there were more, circling the cabin. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove, tires spinning in the dirt. The trees seemed to press in tighter, as if the forest itself didn't want me to leave. When I finally hit pavement, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know this. I won't be going back. I never should have taken that trip alone. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything: work, stress, people. Just me. A small rented cabin deep in the woods, and silence. The kind of quiet you don't get in the city, the kind that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. No neighbors, no streetlights, no cars buzzing in the distance. Just me and nature. It seemed perfect. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. One bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and an open space that served as both the kitchen and the living area. There was a fireplace, but I didn't plan on using it. A space heater stood in the corner, and that was enough. The floors creaked with every step. The wooden walls carried the scent of damp logs and age, and the windows were small. Too small. The first night was uneventful. I read a little, made some coffee, and sat outside on the porch, listening to the wind push through the trees. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. The air was crisp, the stars brighter than I'd ever seen. No distractions, just me. But something changed on the second night. Started small. A sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Something different. A soft shuffling just outside. I sat up in bed, listening, heart hammering. Stopped, but I was wide awake now. I tried to shake it off. Probably a raccoon or a deer passing by. I was in their space after all. Then, the next morning, I found footprints. Not animal prints. Human. They started near the tree line and led up to my porch, stopping just in front of the door. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone outside at all since arriving. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach twisting itself into knots. The dirt was still slightly damp, meaning they had to be fresh, maybe from the night before. Someone had been here. I scanned the woods, searching for movement. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I told myself it was some hiker who had gotten lost, maybe looking for shelter, then changed their mind. I wanted to believe that. I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself I was overthinking it. That night, I stayed up later than usual, my ears tuned to every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard it again. That soft, deliberate shuffling. Closer this time. I held my breath. Then a soft thud against the door. Not a knock, just a dull impact like someone pressing their weight against it. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The doorknob rattled. Not hard, but enough. Enough to make my blood turn ice cold. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy metal flashlight, and held it tight, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise, gripping that flashlight like my life depended on it. When morning came, I checked the door. No signs of forced entry, but the footprints were back. This time, more of them. They circled the cabin. I should have packed up and left, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was just being stubborn. I decided to stay one more night. That was a mistake. I barricaded the door with a chair. Not that it would do much. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening, waiting. The woods outside felt different that night. Heavier, like they were holding their breath, waiting with me. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not trying to hide anymore. Closer. The wooden steps of the porch groaned under weight. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. My breath came in shallow gasps. Then the doorknob rattled again. Harder this time. A scraping sound against the wood. Slow. Purposeful. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whoever was out there, they were waiting, testing me, seeing if I would react. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. Felt like hours. My body ached, my throat dry from breathing through my mouth, trying to stay quiet. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. The first thing I noticed was the door. It was open, not all the way, just a crack, but enough. I felt sick, The chair I had used to block it was toppled over, pushed aside like it was nothing. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. I should have run. I should have bolted out of that cabin and never looked back. But I needed to know. I needed to see if whoever had come inside was still here. I stood up slowly, my legs weak beneath me. I held my breath as I pushed the door open wider with the flashlight, scanning the room. My bag was still in the corner, untouched. The kitchen looked the same. Nothing was out of place, except for one thing. A knife from the kitchen lay on the floor near the door. A large, sharp knife I hadn't used since arriving. That was it. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror, and for just a second, I swore I saw a figure standing in the doorway. I never went back, never reported it. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I don't want to know, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if they ever stopped following me. I took the cabin job because I needed the money, and it seemed easy enough. The owner, an old man named Richard, said it was simple work. Stay there for a month, watch over the property, keep the generator running, and make sure no squatters or animals messed with the place. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and that suited me fine. I wanted to be alone for a while. The first few days were uneventful. The cabin was old but sturdy, built to last, with thick wooden walls and a stone fireplace. There was a shed out back where the generator hummed quietly, keeping the lights on. I had enough canned food and bottled water to last the month, and my only real job was making sure nothing happened to the place. But by the fourth night, I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. The first was the lock on the front door. I always locked it before bed, but one morning, I found it unlatched. I told myself I must have forgotten. The next night, I double-checked. When I woke up, it was unlocked again. Then there were the footprints. Not mine, mine were wider, heavier. These were narrow, barefoot prints in the dirt around the cabin. They led from the tree line to the porch and then back again. I checked the shed, thinking maybe someone had been messing with the generator, but nothing was touched. I walked around the cabin, listening, but the woods were still, too still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping with my rifle beside me. Every night I heard noises, twigs snapping, something brushing against the cabin walls. Once, I swore I heard breathing just outside my bedroom window. I kept the shutters closed after that. One evening, just before sunset, I hiked down to the lake about a mile from the cabin. I needed to clear my head. The lake was calm, the surface smooth and glassy. I sat on the shore for a while, listening to the water lap against the rocks. When I turned to leave, I saw them, footprints in the damp soil, leading from the trees to the water's edge. Whoever had left them had walked straight into the lake, but there were no prints leading back out. I ran back to the cabin, locked every door, checked every window. I sat up all night, my rifle in my lap, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard soft footsteps on the porch, then a long, slow scratch against the wood. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found the door unlocked again. This time, I knew I hadn't forgotten. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bags, called Richard, told him I was leaving. He didn't seem surprised, just sighed and said, "Yeah, thought you might." I never went back to that cabin, never looked back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't meant to be seen, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it wanted. I had been looking for some time alone. Work was wearing me down, and city life had me feeling trapped. So when I found an isolated cabin listing online, deep in the woods, I didn't hesitate to book it. The description made it sound perfect, quiet, surrounded by nature, no distractions. Exactly what I needed. The drive up there took longer than expected. The roads turned from smooth pavement to cracked gravel, then finally to dirt. It had rained recently, and my tires struggled in the mud. Tall, dense trees lined the road, pressing in close. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows. The cabin was small but solid. The wood was aged, but it looked sturdy. There was a wraparound porch, a single window in the front, and a door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, everything was simple: wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen with outdated appliances. There was a single bedroom and a bathroom that smelled faintly of damp wood. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of the forest. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple meal, sat by the fireplace, and listened to the sounds of the forest outside. There was no TV, no internet, just me and the crackling fire. It was peaceful, but something changed on the second night. I had been outside, chopping some wood, when I noticed something odd. Deep footprints in the mud near the tree line. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out that way. The prints were fresh, the edges sharp. They led toward the cabin but didn't lead away. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe I had just missed seeing them earlier. I shook it off and went inside. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see something staring back. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just silence. Then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a creaking sound. Not from the cabin settling, not from the wind, because there was none, but from the porch. A slow, deliberate creak, like the weight of someone stepping carefully. My body went rigid. I held my breath, ears straining. Then, another creak, closer this time. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed, my fingers fumbling with the switch. I clicked it on and aimed it at the window, but all I saw was darkness. No movement, no shape, nothing. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was just an animal, something small. Raccoons or foxes, maybe. But as I lay back down, another sound sent my pulse hammering. The doorknob rattled. It wasn't violent, not like someone trying to force their way in. It was slow, careful, testing. I didn't move. My breath came in shallow, quiet gasps. I listened. The knob stopped rattling, but I could hear something else now. A faint scraping sound, like nails against wood. I sat up, heart pounding. I had locked the door before bed. I was sure of it. I grabbed the hunting knife I had brought with me, just for safety, and held it tightly. Minutes passed. The sounds stopped. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak, every shift of the cabin made my nerves jump. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The footprints were back, but this time they led from the porch into the woods. I followed them for a few yards before they suddenly disappeared, as if whoever or whatever had been standing there had vanished into thin air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe my own mind playing games with me. But the feeling of being watched never left. The third night, I barely turned off the lights. I sat by the fireplace, knife within reach, listening. At some point, exhaustion got the best of me. I drifted off in the chair. I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't locked it. I had been too tired, too distracted. My mistake. Slowly, I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My eyes darted around the dark cabin, scanning for movement. The door was open just a crack, enough for a sliver of moonlight to seep in. Then I saw it. A shadow, barely visible in the doorway. Motionless, watching. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward, kicking the door shut with all my strength and locking it in one motion. My heart pounded in my ears. Silence. Then, slow footsteps on the porch, pacing, back and forth. Then nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sky turned gray with morning light, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't care about my deposit, didn't care about leaving the place a mess. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, until the trees thinned and civilization returned. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I never found out who it was, or what they wanted. But I know this. I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I drove up the narrow dirt road, my tires crunching against the gravel as I climbed deeper into the woods. The sun had started dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched across my windshield. I had found the cabin listing online. Cheap, isolated, and available for an entire month. It sounded perfect. I needed to be away from everything. No distractions, no stress, just me and silence. The trees thickened as I drove, their trunks towering high and bending slightly with the wind. The further I went, the less light I had. My GPS lost signal about 15 minutes ago, but I had the directions written down. After another 5 minutes, the cabin appeared, tucked between the trees like it had been waiting for me. It was smaller than I expected. The wooden walls looked aged, darkened by years of exposure to rain and wind. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the single window in front was covered in grime. I parked the car, stepped out, and stretched my legs. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, fresh but heavy. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, locked the car, and climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under my weight. I unlocked the door, pushing it open with a slow creak. The inside was exactly as advertised, bare, but enough. A couch against one wall, a small kitchenette, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a stack of logs beside it. I walked through, checking the place. The bathroom had running water, though it sputtered a bit before coming out clean. The bedroom had a simple wooden bed frame with a mattress covered in a thick layer of dust. I stripped the sheets, shaking them outside before laying out my own sleeping bag on top of the mattress. The silence was deep. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no background noise. Just the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. It was peaceful. I was finally alone. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking, setting up my laptop on the small wooden table. There was no Wi-Fi, but I planned for that. I wanted to write, read, think. I cooked a quick meal on the old gas stove, eating while the sky outside turned black. When I finally lay down, exhaustion hit me fast, and I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up suddenly. It was still dark. A sound had pulled me from sleep. Something outside. I listened, lying still. The trees creaked with the wind. The branches scratched against the roof. Then there it was again. A crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath, heart thudding. Probably an animal. A deer, maybe a raccoon. I turned over, closed my eyes again. Another crunch. Closer. I sat up, listening harder. The sound stopped. The wind whistled through the trees, but nothing else moved. I reached for my phone. No service. I checked the time, 3:12 a.m. I stayed still for a long time. Eventually, sleep pulled me back under. The next morning, I stepped outside. The air was cold, the sun barely warming the ground. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just endless forest. I walked around the cabin, crunching leaves under my own boots, trying to recreate the sound I'd heard last night. It matched, probably just an animal. Still, I checked the windows and door, making sure they were locked. They were. I spent the day writing. The words came slow, my mind distracted. I kept looking at the window, expecting to see something. By the time the sun started setting, I felt exhausted, but not sleepy. I double-checked the locks before going to bed. I woke up to the same sound. Crunch. I didn't move. My breath came slow, controlled. Crunch. Closer. Right outside. Then a light tap, like fingers against wood. My skin crawled. My pulse hammered. I turned my head slowly toward the window. The glass was too dirty to see anything clearly. Just a shape, a dark outline standing still. I didn't move. The shape didn't either. Then it shifted, slowly. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight beside my bed, and clicked it on, aiming it at the window. The light bounced back at me, reflecting off the glass. The shape was gone. I sat there, heart pounding. Nothing moved outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slow. I checked outside again, looking for tracks. There were none. I wanted to leave. Something felt wrong. But the thought of packing up and driving back through miles of empty forest in the dark made me stay. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Lack of sleep, the isolation, my mind playing tricks on me. That night, I barricaded the door with the small wooden table and sat on the couch, a knife in my hand. I waited. The wind blew. The trees creaked. Then, a knock. Not a polite one. Hard, slow, deliberate. I gripped the knife tighter. My chest felt tight. Another knock. The door rattled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I stayed like that for hours, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rental agreement, the money I had already paid. I drove away without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that cabin. The first mistake was thinking I'd be alone. The second was believing that would make me safer. I had been searching for isolation, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, the kind of place where cell service was a joke. That was the point. Just me, a week's worth of food, a stack of books and silence. The drive out was uneventful. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. The trees pressed in tight, branches scraping my truck as if warning me to turn around. I didn't. I had been waiting for this trip for months, eager to shut out the world. The cabin was exactly as described, small, sturdy, weathered by time. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old wood stove, a hand pump for water outside, and a lantern hanging from a nail on the wall. Felt perfect. The first day was peaceful. I chopped some wood, settled in, cooked a simple meal on the stove, and read until my eyes got heavy. That night, the quiet was so thick it pressed against me. No hum of a refrigerator, no distant traffic, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind, just stillness. It was the second night when I noticed something was off. I woke up cold. The fire burned down to embers. As I got up to throw more wood in, I noticed the door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I told myself I must have been tired, must have forgotten. I locked it and went back to bed. The next morning, I saw the footprints. Not mine, not barefoot, not animal. Boots, deep impressions in the damp earth, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. I felt a slow, crawling sensation in my gut. Someone had been out there, watching. I reminded myself I was miles from anywhere, probably just some hunter curious. But they had come too close, too quiet. I kept the axe nearby after that. That night, I locked the door, checked it twice. I moved the heavy woodpile against it, just in case. Sleep came in fits, light and uneasy. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the unmistakable sound of something moving outside. The crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I just listened. My breath held tight in my chest. The sound circled the cabin. I could hear breathing. Close, too close. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the axe, heart hammering. When daylight came, I stepped outside, muscles stiff from holding still for so long. More footprints, fresh ones, the same boots pacing the cabin. But this time they led to the door, stopped, then turned back into the trees. Someone was testing me, seeing if I'd react, if I'd panic. I packed my things. I had paid for the full week, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying. I loaded up the truck and turned the key. Nothing. The truck wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the cables. Everything was fine. No reason it shouldn't turn over. My gut twisted. This wasn't random. Someone had done this. I had no choice but to hike. The nearest road was miles away, but I knew the direction. I took only what I needed: a knife, a flashlight, some water. I locked the cabin behind me, not that it mattered. I had a feeling whoever was out there wasn't worried about locked doors. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps. Every so often I stopped, listened. Nothing. But that feeling, that skin-prickling sense of being watched never left. Then I saw them. In the trees just ahead, half hidden behind a thick trunk. A figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't run. I wanted to, but running means you're prey. I gripped the knife tighter and kept walking, steady. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I walked for hours, muscles burning, mouth dry. I reached the road just as the sun started dipping low. Relief washed over me when I saw a truck in the distance. An old man behind the wheel. I flagged him down, breathless. Truck broke down. I managed. Need a ride? He nodded, didn't ask questions. I glanced back once toward the tree line. The figure was gone, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. I never went back for the truck. Never told anyone the full story. Just filed a report, called the rental company, and let it go. But sometimes at night, when everything is too quiet, I think about the footprints circling that cabin, about the figure in the woods, and I wonder if I had stayed just one more night, would I have made it out at all? I didn't plan on staying in that cabin for long. It was supposed to be a temporary thing, just a few weeks, maybe a month at most. A break from everything. City noise, endless work emails, people. I wanted the quiet and I got it. More than I ever asked for. I found the place online. A single-room cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but the pictures looked fine. A small wooden structure with a tin roof, a front porch with an old rocking chair, and a wood-burning stove inside. No electricity, no running water, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted to be alone. Getting there was harder than I thought. The gravel road leading up the mountain was barely a road at all, more like a beaten path carved through thick trees. My car struggled, tires spinning in the loose dirt, but I managed to reach the clearing where the cabin stood. The air was different up there, heavy, still. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but expectant, like the woods were waiting for something. The first night was fine, cold but fine. I set up my sleeping bag on the small cot, started a fire in the stove, and read by candlelight. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls, but inside, it was warm, safe. I told myself I'd made the right choice. By the third night, I started noticing things. Small things at first. My backpack wasn't where I'd left it. The axe by the woodpile was missing but turned up again a few feet away. I convinced myself I was just being careless. I wasn't used to living alone in the woods, after all. But then the sounds started. Not animal sounds. I knew what those sounded like. These were different. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside. I'd hear them late at night, always just past the tree line. Never close enough to see anything but too distinct to ignore. I'd step outside with my flashlight, shine it toward the trees, but there was nothing. Just the forest stretching on forever, black and empty. I stopped sleeping properly. Every little noise jolted me awake. My nerves were raw, my brain convinced that I wasn't alone. Then one night I woke up to the door open. Not unlocked, wide open. The cold air bit through my sleeping bag. My flashlight was on the floor, the battery's dead. I hadn't left the door open. I knew that for sure. The next day, I searched the cabin. Every inch of it. The walls were thin. The floor creaked under every step. But there were no signs of forced entry. No footprints inside. I tried to tell myself the wind had blown it open. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been inside. I wanted to leave. I packed my things, threw them in the car. But when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. Battery was fine. Gas was fine. It just wouldn't turn over. My hands were shaking when I popped the hood. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to see that something was off. Wires had been cut. Clean cuts. Deliberate. I was stuck. That night, I barricaded the door with the old rocking chair. I barely slept, clutching my hunting knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other. Hours passed. The woods were silent. Then, at some point, I heard breathing. right outside the cabin. Slow, deep, someone standing just beyond the door, waiting. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, and then footsteps. Slow, measured steps circling the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. I didn't move until morning. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to step outside. My hands were shaking, my throat dry. I walked around the cabin, half expecting to see nothing, hoping I'd imagined it all. But there were tracks in the dirt, footprints, leading from the trees to my door and back again. Someone had been there. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, my knife, anything useful, and started walking. I didn't know how far the nearest town was, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The forest was silent as I walked. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps, too loud in the stillness. And then I saw it. Ahead of me, pinned to a tree with my missing axe, was a note. A single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. My name was written on it. Just my name. I didn't stop to read the rest. I ran. I don't remember much after that. Just running, stumbling, pushing forward until I saw a road. An actual paved road. A truck passed, slowed when they saw me, and I must have looked bad because they didn't hesitate to pick me up. I never went back for my car. Never went back for anything. Whatever was up there in those woods, it didn't want me there. And I wasn't about to find out why. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Just me, the quiet of the woods, and a break from the constant noise of life. Work had been wearing me down, and I needed something, anything, to clear my mind. The idea of camping alone always had this strange appeal, like I was proving something to myself, testing my ability to be alone in nature. I picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from any marked trails. I wanted isolation, no sounds of other campers, no distant conversations. Just the wind, the trees, and whatever small creatures moved through the underbrush. I parked my truck on the side of a dirt road that wasn't even on the map, loaded up my gear, and started hiking. The deeper I went, the more peaceful it felt. By the time I found a good place to set up camp, the sun was starting to lower in the sky. It was a clearing surrounded by thick trees, giving me just enough space to set up my tent and build a fire. I could hear a small creek running nearby, which was perfect for getting water. The air smelled fresh, clean, untouched. This was exactly what I needed. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a fire as the last bit of daylight faded. As I sat there, eating a simple meal, I let the silence settle around me. There was no hum of traffic, no distant city lights, just the flicker of the fire and the occasional rustling in the bushes. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the usual noises of the forest. It was faint, distant at first, but enough to make me sit up and listen. It wasn't an animal sound, not the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof or the call of an owl. It was something else, something deliberate. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the natural sounds of the woods playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, like footsteps, not heavy enough to be a bear, not fast enough to be a running deer. It was slow, measured, like someone taking their time. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just trees, darkness, and the eerie stillness that follows after you've made noise. My heart was beating faster than I liked, but I shook it off. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe some animal was just moving through the woods. I forced myself to relax, throwing another log onto the fire, trying to focus on its warmth. But the sound came back, closer this time. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped when I focused on them, like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was aware. I swept my flashlight in slow arcs, searching the trees for movement. Still nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in the woods, and my mind was naturally looking for threats. I needed to sleep, I locked my food up in a bear-proof container, made sure my fire was burning strong, and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound felt amplified. Every shift of the wind against the trees made me tense up. At some point, exhaustion won over and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. No noise, no disturbance. Just a feeling, that overwhelming, gut-deep instinct that something is wrong. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and listened. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint orange light against the walls of my tent. Then I heard it, right outside my tent. A breath, not the wind, not an animal sniffing around. A breath, slow and steady, human. Every hair on my body stood on end. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But why would they just be standing outside my tent, not saying anything? I waited, gripping my knife, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. No footsteps, no retreating sounds, just silence. I stayed awake until dawn. The second there was enough light, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, scanning the area. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. Just my campsite, the ashes of my fire, and the endless trees. But I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been there. I packed up quickly. My plan had been to stay another night, but my gut told me to leave. As I hiked back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing. Just trees, just the path, just the unsettling feeling that I had been watched all night. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. Then I saw it, on the dirt near my driver's side door. Footprints, not mine, not from hiking boots, bare feet. I had planned the hike for months, a solo trip through the backcountry, just me, my gear, and miles of untouched wilderness. It wasn't my first time alone out there. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, some longer than this one, some in even harsher conditions. But something about this trip felt different from the start. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was barely up, and the air was crisp. The parking lot was empty. That was expected. This was a lesser-known trail, one that didn't attract many people. That's why I picked it. I liked the solitude. I liked the idea of going days without seeing another person. Just me and the trees, the wind, the distant calls of birds. I wanted to feel small against the vastness of nature. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail. The first few miles were easy, well-marked, and sloped gently upward. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to drink water or check my map. My goal was to reach a clearing near the river by midday, where I'd set up camp for the night. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became. It was clear this part of the forest didn't see much foot traffic. The trees stood closer together, their branches reaching toward each other, forming a canopy that dimmed the light. The air was cool, damp. Every so often, I caught the scent of decaying leaves, that rich, earthy smell that always reminded me of autumn. It was peaceful in a way, but there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, a quietness that felt unnatural. I pressed on, ignoring the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. By noon, I had covered most of the distance and only had another mile or so before I'd reach the river. I was feeling good, strong, but then I noticed something strange. The trail, what had been a clear, well-worn path, was getting harder to follow. The dirt turned uneven, covered in thick moss, as if no one had walked this way in years. I pulled out my map again, checked my GPS. Everything told me I was still on track, but something felt off. The forest looked different. I kept going, stepping carefully. The silence grew heavier. Even the birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the occasional creak of a tree in the wind. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree stump, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A backpack, weathered, torn, old. It was half buried under a thick layer of leaves. I knelt down, brushing the debris away. The fabric crumbled under my fingers, brittle with age. I looked around. No sign of anyone. No footprints. Nothing. I stood up, suddenly aware of how alone I was. My mind started racing. Maybe someone had abandoned it years ago. Maybe it had fallen off a hiker's back. But something about it made my skin crawl. It didn't look like it had just been left behind. It looked placed. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move on. Whatever happened here wasn't my business. I just needed to get to my campsite. I walked faster, my eyes scanning the forest, my ears straining for any sound. But the silence followed me, thick and suffocating. Then, not far ahead, I saw something else. Another piece of gear half hidden in the undergrowth. A jacket, faded and torn. And next to it, a single hiking boot. My stomach dropped. The boot wasn't old. It wasn't crumbling like the backpack. It looked recent. I turned in a slow circle, heart pounding. There was no one around. No signs of movement. The forest stood still, watching. Something was very wrong. I needed to leave. Now, I pulled out my GPS again, ready to turn back. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. No signal. I tried my phone. Same thing. No service. My hands felt clammy, my breathing shallow. I wasn't lost. I knew that. But suddenly, I felt like I had stepped into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I started back the way I came, moving quickly, trying not to panic. But after 20 minutes of walking, I stopped. The trail was gone. I should have reached the last marker by now. I should have recognized something, a tree, a rock formation, anything. But the landscape had changed. Or maybe I had. I turned in another slow circle, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't lost. I was somewhere else. I swallowed hard and forced myself to think. I had food, water, and shelter. I wasn't in immediate danger. I needed to stay calm. I decided to set up camp while I still had daylight. I found a relatively flat area between two trees and pitched my tent. I gathered firewood, lit a small fire, and sat with my back against a tree, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach was tight with unease. The fire crackled, its glow pushing back the dark. I kept my headlamp on, scanning the trees every few minutes, expecting. What? I didn't know. I barely slept. Every rustle in the bushes sent my heart racing. Every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Just the isolation, the darkness, the unfamiliar terrain. But then, just before dawn, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the random crunch of an animal in the brush. Not the shifting of branches in the wind. Real, deliberate footsteps. Close. I held my breath, body frozen. The fire had burned low, just embers now. Barely enough light to see beyond the edge of my camp. I strained my ears, listening. Silence. And then, just as the first light of morning crept through the trees, I saw them. Bare footprints in the dirt. Fresh. They hadn't been there the night before. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I moved as fast as I could, pushing through branches, stumbling over roots, my breath ragged. And then, finally, I saw it. The parking lot. My car. I almost collapsed with relief. I don't know how I got off the trail. I don't know who or what was out there with me. But I do know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again. I never believed in any of the things people said about that house at the end of the road. It was just a house like any other. I passed it every day on my way to work. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded with dirt, and the front steps sagged like they had given up. People in the neighborhood whispered about the strange things that happened inside. But I never paid attention. Stories spread easily in small towns. I wasn't the type to believe in nonsense. It started when I moved in. I hadn't planned to, but the price was too good. A house that size with a basement and an attic should have cost 3 times as much. The seller barely looked at me when I signed the papers, and when I asked about the price, he just mumbled something about the market being bad. I took the deal. The first few nights were quiet. I was still unpacking, getting used to the place. The floors creaked under my feet, and the wind slipped through cracks in the walls. That was normal. It was an old house. The weird thing was the air. Felt heavy, thick in a way that made my chest tight. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like damp wood or mildew, but it got stronger. It wasn't just in one place either. One day, the living room smelled like rotting leaves. The next, my bedroom had the sour scent of something burned. I checked everywhere. Under the floorboards, inside the walls, but I never found the source. The smell would vanish as quickly as it appeared, like it had never been there. The noises came next. Not the usual old house sounds, but something else. At night, I'd hear soft, shuffling movements above me. I convinced myself it was just rats in the attic. But then I'd hear them behind me, just outside the door, in the hallway. Always soft, always just out of sight. I set traps. Nothing. I tried recording the sounds, but when I played the audio back, all I heard was silence. One night, I woke up gasping, my chest tight like something was sitting on it. The room was boiling hot, my skin damp with sweat. My window was open, even though I knew I had locked it. I shut it again and went back to sleep. The next morning, it was wide open. This happened again and again. I stopped closing it. It didn't matter. I barely slept anymore. My body felt heavier every day. My head clouded like I was walking through fog. My coworkers noticed. "You look like hell," they said. I felt worse than I looked. The worst part was the basement. I avoided it. Something about it made my skin crawl. The air was colder down there, thick with the scent of earth. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with things left behind by the previous owner. Old photographs, yellowed papers, rusted tools. One night, I finally worked up the courage to go through it all. That's when I found the door. It was in the farthest corner, hidden behind a shelf. A door made of thick wood, with iron bolts and no handle. It looked older than the rest of the house. I don't know why, but the sight of it made my stomach drop. I pressed my hand against it, expecting it to be ice cold, but it was warm, too warm, like something behind it was alive. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I dreamed about it. In my dreams, the door was open. Darkness spilled out, thick like oil, filling the basement, rising up the stairs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every night, the same dream. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back down, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. I wasn't thinking straight. I just wanted it gone. I jammed the crowbar into the frame and pulled. The wood groaned, the bolts screeched. The door didn't give, but something else did. The smell hit me first, stronger than ever. Rotting meat, wet earth, a deep, metallic scent like rusted iron. My eyes watered, my stomach churned. Then came the sound. A low, steady hum, like something breathing. Not the house, not the wind, something else. I dropped the crowbar and ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my breath tearing through my throat. I stood there in the cold, staring at the house, my hands shaking. I knew in that moment I couldn't stay. I left everything behind, packed a single bag and drove away without looking back. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for days. Months later, the house is still there, standing at the end of the road, empty and waiting. I never went back, never tried to find out more. I don't need to. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. There was something about being alone in the woods that made me feel like I could breathe properly, away from the chaos of everyday life. No phone buzzing, no work emails, just me, my tent, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, about 5 miles off the main trail. It wasn't an official camping area, but I had scouted it out a few weeks prior and marked it on my GPS. A flat clearing by a small stream, with plenty of dry wood nearby for a fire. Perfect. The hike in was uneventful, though I noticed how quiet the woods were. No birds, no chittering squirrels, just the sound of my boots crunching over dead leaves and twigs. It didn't bother me much at the time. Animals tend to avoid people. I reached my campsite in the late afternoon, set up my tent, and collected enough firewood to last me through the night. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I had a strong fire going. I sat on a fallen log, eating a meal out of a can and enjoying the stillness. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant rustling of branches. Probably just the wind. Probably. That first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to an odd noise. It wasn't an animal sound, not the snapping of a twig or the hoot of an owl. It was breathing. Deep, steady breathing. It was close. My blood ran cold as I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound lasted for what felt like forever, and then it was gone. I sat up slowly, unzipping my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long shadows against the trees. But I saw nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Still, I kept my knife close for the rest of the night. The next morning, I chalked it up to my imagination. I was alone in the woods. The mind plays tricks. I forced myself to shake off the unease and went about my day. I hiked up a ridge, took some pictures, enjoyed the quiet. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found myself checking over my shoulder too often, listening too hard for sounds that weren't there. That night, I built my fire bigger, brighter. I felt safer with the flames casting light around my small camp. I stayed up later than I should have, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, exhausted. And then, just like the night before, I woke up to the sound of breathing. But this time it was closer, right outside the tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I reached slowly for my knife. The breathing was heavy, almost deliberate. And then, a slow drag of something sharp against the fabric of my tent. Not cutting, just testing. I couldn't move. I could barely think. I wanted to run, but running where? Into the trees? In the dark? I forced myself to take a breath, steady my shaking hands. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I didn't dare check outside this time. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn seeped through my tent. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints circling my campsite. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I packed up in record time. I didn't care that I had planned for another night. I didn't care about breakfast. I just needed to get out. I practically ran the first 2 miles back to the main trail. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like whoever or whatever had been outside my tent was still there, just beyond the trees, just out of sight. I made it back to my car without incident. The moment I was inside with the doors locked, I finally let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for hours. I never went back to that spot. I don't camp alone anymore. Some things aren't worth the risk. And the worst part? When I got home and checked my GPS, I realized something. I had marked the wrong clearing. The one I camped at wasn't the one I had scouted. It wasn't mine at all. I never believed in curses or bad omens. But looking back, I can't think of any other way to explain what happened to me in that house. It started with an ad. A rental listing on a small website, nothing fancy. The house was old but cheap, too cheap. The owner wanted a long-term tenant, someone responsible. That was me. I worked remotely, had no family tying me down, and needed a quiet place to focus. Felt perfect. The first time I walked through the door, the air inside felt still, too still, like the house had been holding its breath. The walls were yellowed with age, the wood floors creaked under my weight, and the windows were dirty, letting in only dull, gray light. It smelled faintly of dust and something stale, something that reminded me of old newspapers left in the rain. At first, nothing felt wrong. The house was just old, abandoned for a while, maybe. I figured I'd get used to it. My days were simple: wake up, work, eat, sleep. But small things started piling up, little details that didn't make sense. The first thing I noticed was the way sound traveled. The house was quiet, but sometimes I'd hear something faint, like movement. Not loud enough to be a person, not distinct enough to be identified. Just a soft rustling, like fabric shifting or someone brushing past a wall. I told myself it was the wind. Old houses settle, right? Then there was the door, the one to the basement. It was locked when I moved in. Not with a normal lock, but a heavy-duty bolt and chain, like something you'd use to keep people out or in. I wasn't told anything about the basement, but the landlord had been distant, uninterested in small talk. The lease said the basement was off limits. I didn't question it. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard something different. Not just the usual settling sounds, but something rhythmic, like a faint tapping. A slow, steady pattern. It came from beneath the floorboards. I held my breath, counting the beats. It lasted for maybe a minute, then silence. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, the sound returned, always late at night. Always the same rhythm. It didn't matter if I was awake or asleep, if I moved rooms, if I stayed still. It followed me like it knew where I was. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it was just in my head, but I could feel it now. A presence. Something unseen pressing in on me. I stopped feeling alone. Things in the house started shifting. A chair I hadn't touched would be slightly out of place. My keys, always left on the kitchen counter, would turn up somewhere else. My phone charger disappeared entirely, only to show up 3 days later inside the bathroom cabinet. I convinced myself I was just tired, distracted. I had to be. Then I found the notebook. It was hidden behind a loose board in the hallway. A small, battered journal with curled edges, the paper yellowed and brittle. The writing inside was frantic, desperate. It started normal enough, dated years before I moved in. The entries were short at first, just mundane details about the house. But as I flipped through, the tone shifted. I hear it too. That was all one entry said. Then another. The door won't stay locked. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It knows when I'm awake. The entries became erratic, the handwriting unstable. Then they stopped, abruptly, with one final message scrawled across the last page. Asterisk, I made a mistake. I let it out. Asterisk. I closed the notebook and sat in silence, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that house. But when I stood, I heard it again. The tapping. Louder this time, insistent. It was coming from the basement door. I don't know what made me move closer. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. My fingers hovered over the chain, and for the first time I saw it properly. The metal was old, but the bolts looked new, fresh scratches where they'd been drilled in tighter. Someone had reinforced it, made sure it stayed shut. The tapping continued. I backed away, heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow felt wrong. Every noise sent my pulse racing. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't care about the lease, the deposit. I just needed to go. I made it halfway down the street before I heard it. A sharp, heavy bang. From inside the house. Then another. And another. I turned back, my stomach twisting. The basement door. The noise wasn't tapping anymore. It was pounding. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I left everything behind. My furniture, my clothes, even my laptop. None of it mattered anymore. I drove until I was hours away, until the house was nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. I don't know what was in that basement. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it in my head. That slow, steady rhythm. Tapping, waiting. And I wonder if the next tenant will be smart enough to leave before it's too late. I love the outdoors. Always have. There's something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, dirt, and the sounds of nature that makes me feel at peace. I've been camping my whole life, and I've always considered myself prepared. No matter what could go wrong, I always had a plan. But this time I wasn't ready. It was late September, and I decided to do a solo camping trip. I had done it plenty of times before and never had a problem. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, away from the crowds and noise. It wasn't a designated campground, just a clearing I had found on an old map. Getting there wasn't easy. The roads were rough, barely more than dirt paths, and full of potholes. My truck's tires kicked up dust as I drove further and further away from civilization. After nearly an hour on those back roads, I finally reached my spot. It was perfect. A wide-open clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, with a small creek nearby for water. I got to work setting up camp. I pitched my tent near the tree-line, set up my cooking gear, and gathered some firewood. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The sun was dipping lower, and the sky turned orange and pink. It was peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food, sat by the fire, and listened to the distant hoots of an owl. The silence was comforting. No people, no city noise, just me and nature. I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the night take over. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of movement outside my tent. My heart started pounding immediately. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. It wasn't the sound of a small animal, it was heavier. Something was walking around my campsite. I slowly reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint light. I swept the flashlight across the clearing, but I didn't see anything. The trees stood tall, motionless. Maybe a deer, I told myself. I waited a few more minutes, listening, but the sound was gone. I eventually went back to sleep, though it took a while for my heart to slow down. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. Not animal tracks, human ones. They weren't mine. My boots had a distinct pattern, and these prints were different. The dirt was disturbed near my tent, like someone had been standing there for a while. A chill ran down my spine. I was miles away from any other campsite. Who else would be out here? I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was an old footprint I hadn't noticed before. Still, I kept my knife on me as I went about my day. The second night, I built a bigger fire. It made me feel safer, though I wasn't sure why. Fire wouldn't stop someone from sneaking around my camp. As I sat by the flames, I kept my ears open. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went to bed, keeping my knife within reach. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises, faint ones, just beyond my campsite. A twig snapping, a distant shuffling. Every time I sat up to listen, it went silent. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. But then, in the dead of night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was something else. A feeling, like I was being watched. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, my ears straining. And then I heard it, breathing, right outside my tent. Slow, steady breaths. Not an animal. Person. My blood turned to ice. My hand wrapped around my knife. I stayed completely still, trying to control my own breathing. Then, the worst part, the zipper of my tent started moving. Slowly, inch by inch, it was being pulled down from the outside. I reacted instantly. I shot up, yelling as loud as I could. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it straight at the tent door. The zipper stopped. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard fast, heavy footsteps running away into the woods. I scrambled out of my tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I pointed the beam toward the trees, but I saw nothing, just darkness and shadows. My whole body was shaking. Someone had been out there. Someone had been trying to get into my tent. I threw everything I could into my truck. I didn't bother packing neatly. I just wanted to get out. I could still feel eyes on me as I rushed to leave. The drive back was a blur. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I finally pulled over, my hands still trembling. I never went back to that spot. Never even tried to find out who it was. Some things I think are better left unknown. But one thing's for sure, I'll never camp alone again. I moved into the house on Turner Street in late October, just as the leaves had turned crisp and the air carried the first bite of winter. It wasn't a house I had dreamed of owning, but it was cheap, and at that point in my life, cheap was all that mattered. It was a simple 2-bedroom place, nothing fancy, nothing out of the ordinary. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind where people nodded at each other but didn't stop to chat. The first few weeks passed without anything unusual. I worked long hours, so I was only home in the evenings, mostly too tired to do much besides eat and sleep. The house felt empty, but not in a lonely way, just in the way that a house does when it hasn't had time to feel like home yet. The creaks and groans of the old floorboards were normal, and if they seemed louder some nights, I chalked it up to the house settling. It was about a month in when I started noticing things. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make someone believe me if I told them. It was just subtle things. A door that I swore I closed would be slightly open when I came back into the room. A drawer that I had left half open would be fully shut. I blamed myself, figured I wasn't paying attention. I was tired. Maybe I was just getting forgetful. Then there was the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just the faintest trace of something sour, something damp. I checked under the sink, in the basement, even inside the walls where the pipes ran, but I couldn't find a source. Some days I wouldn't notice it at all and I'd forget about it. Other days it clung to the air so thickly that I felt like it was settling on my skin. The sounds started next. A soft rustling, almost like the wind, except there was no wind inside the house. A scrape like furniture moving, but nothing was out of place. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure I'd heard footsteps just outside my bedroom door. I'd lie there, holding my breath, listening, but nothing would come after it. No door creaking open, no voice calling out. Just silence so deep it made my ears ring. I stopped sleeping well. Every little sound jolted me awake. My dreams became filled with strange images. Dark corners that stretched too far, empty rooms that felt too full, glimpses of something just out of view. I started waking up feeling like I hadn't been alone in my sleep, but there was never anyone there. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling grew, day by day, like something pressing in, like a weight that never lifted. I started dreading coming home. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a heaviness, a wrongness that I couldn't put into words. One night, I fell asleep on the couch. It wasn't intentional. I had been watching something on TV, trying to stay awake just a little longer because I didn't want to go to bed. I woke up to silence, the kind that wasn't just quiet but empty, unnatural. I sat up, still groggy, and reached for my phone. The screen showed 3:14 a.m. That was when I noticed it. The couch beneath me felt damp. Not soaked, just slightly wet. Enough to make my skin crawl. I jumped up, heart pounding, and flipped on every light in the room. The fabric of the couch was darker in some spots, like whatever had soaked into it was still fresh. I touched it cold. The sour smell filled my nose, stronger than ever, thick and cloying. I had had enough. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the house without looking back. I got in my car, turned the heat up as high as it would go, and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached. I stayed in a motel that night, and the next, and the one after that. I couldn't bring myself to go back. I told myself I'd hire someone to check it out, maybe have the place inspected for mold, for leaks, for anything that could explain it. But I never did, couldn't. 3 weeks later, I put the house up for sale. I didn't go back inside. I hired someone to pack up my things and ship them to a storage unit. I didn't want to touch anything from that house. I didn't want to smell it, didn't want to remember it. I never found out what was wrong with that place. I never found out why it felt so off, why the air felt too thick, why the silence felt too loud. I don't need to know. I just know I left, and I know I'll never go back. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the quiet sounds of nature. No emails, no phone calls, no city noise. Just me, a stocked fridge, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for years. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from my apartment. I had rented it through some obscure website that specialized in off-grid locations, places where people went to truly disconnect. It wasn't cheap, but I figured it would be worth it. The listing had promised complete isolation, no neighbors within miles, and all the basics: running water, a wood-burning stove, and enough electricity from a solar panel setup to keep the lights on and a mini fridge running. The drive was smooth, and as I got closer, the roads became narrower and rougher. The last 30 minutes were spent on a dirt path, my tires kicking up dust as I navigated deep potholes and overgrown branches. Finally, the cabin came into view, a small structure with a green metal roof and dark wooden walls, sitting alone in a clearing. Behind it, the dense forest stretched out endlessly. I parked the car, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, untouched. I grabbed my bags and stepped up onto the porch. The key was right where the owner said it would be, under a loose floorboard near the door. I let myself in, locking the door behind me out of habit. Inside, it was just as the pictures had shown. Simple but cozy. A main room with a small kitchen area, a couch, and a wood stove. A short hallway led to the bedroom and a bathroom with an old but functional shower. The windows were large, letting in plenty of light, but there were no curtains, just open glass, giving me an unobstructed view of the trees outside. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my food and making a small fire in the stove to cut the evening chill. The silence was almost overwhelming. No traffic, no distant hum of city life, just the occasional rustling of leaves or the chirp of a bird. It was exactly what I had wanted. That first night, I slept deeply. The bed was firmer than I liked, but exhaustion from the drive knocked me out. When I woke up, the sun was already high, streaming through the windows. I spent the morning reading and drinking coffee on the porch, the sound of the wind moving through the trees almost hypnotic. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something strange. I had been sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then I heard it again. A crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. Not like an animal moving naturally through the woods, but like footsteps. I set my book down and stood up, walking to the window. I stared out into the darkness, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Nothing. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door and checked the windows before heading to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. A noise, something outside. Not just wind this time, it was close. I sat up, listening, holding my breath. Then footsteps on the porch. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced. Could be an animal. A bear, maybe. But bears don't climb steps like that. And then, the worst sound imaginable. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, not turning it on yet. I listened, every muscle in my body tense. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, soft footsteps moving away from the door, back down the porch steps. I waited, counting the seconds. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off, still clutching the flashlight. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here, watching, trying to get in, and they weren't wearing shoes. I spent the entire day on edge. My original plan had been to stay the whole week, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was some drifter passing through. Either way, I kept my knife within reach and made sure the door was locked well before sundown. That night, I didn't sleep at all. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful, circling the cabin, then tapping on the windows. Not knocking, just tapping, moving from one window to the next. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, knife clutched in my hand. My phone had no signal, no way to call for help. I was on my own. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I thought maybe, just maybe, whoever it was had gone. But then, a sound that chilled me to my core. A whisper, right outside my bedroom window. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone was whispering just outside the glass. I stayed frozen in place, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. And then, just like that, they were gone. I didn't sleep. I sat up until the first light of dawn, every muscle in my body screaming from exhaustion. The moment the sun was up, I grabbed my keys, my bag, and I left. I didn't even bother packing the rest of my stuff. I ran to my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I was hours away, back in the safety of civilization. Even now, weeks later, I still don't know what I encountered out there. A drifter? A lunatic living in the woods? Someone who liked to play games with the people who rented that cabin? I'll never know. But I do know this: I will never go back. I never thought it would get this bad. I never thought I'd be looking over my shoulder every second of the day, afraid to close my eyes at night. But here I am, trapped in my own life, like an animal being watched from the darkness. It started small, almost unnoticeable. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. The first time I felt it, I was walking home from work. The street was empty, just the sound of my own footsteps on the pavement. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones, making you walk faster without realizing it. I don't know why, but I glanced over my shoulder. There was no one there, just the streetlights casting long shadows, the empty sidewalk stretching behind me. But something felt wrong. The air had that strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I shook it off and kept walking, blaming my nerves, blaming the late hour, blaming the horror movies I sometimes watched alone. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me home, clung to me like a second skin. I double-checked my locks that night, something I never really did before. I lived alone in a small apartment, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and eat. The door had 2 locks. I turned them both, listening for the click that meant I was safe. Then I went to bed, pushing away the unease. The next morning, I told myself I was overthinking. But as the days passed, little things started to stand out. My front door lock felt different, like someone had touched it. My bedroom window, which I always kept shut, was open one morning. Just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough to make my stomach turn. I told myself it was the wind, that maybe I had left it open without realizing. But doubt had already crept in, and once it was there, it wouldn't leave. Then the messages started. Not texts, not emails, but handwritten notes. The first one was on my windshield when I left work. It was small, a single piece of paper tucked under the wiper. My name was written on it. Just my name. That was it. I stared at it for a long time. My heart was beating too fast. My fingers clenched around the paper so tightly it crumpled. I looked around the parking lot, but there was no one there. Just cars, rows of them, silent and still. The note shouldn't have been a big deal. It was just my name, but it felt wrong. Felt like a warning. I drove home with my mind racing. Who would do this? A prank? Someone at work? But it didn't feel like a joke. Felt personal, and it was only the beginning. The next one was inside my apartment. I found it on my kitchen counter when I got home the following evening. I froze in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. The paper was right there, in the middle of the counter, waiting for me. This time, it wasn't just my name. It said, "I see you." My blood turned to ice. I stood there, not moving, trying to make sense of it. My door had been locked. My windows had been closed. No one had been inside. At least that's what I thought. But the note was there. Someone had been in my home. Someone had left this for me to find. I called the police that night. I sat in my living room, the phone pressed to my ear, my hands shaking. When they arrived, they checked the locks, the windows, everything. But there were no signs of forced entry. They asked me if I had left my door unlocked. I told them no, I was sure I hadn't. But I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was mistaken, that maybe I had left the door open, that maybe I was overreacting. They took the note but didn't seem too concerned. "Keep your doors locked," they said. "Call us if anything else happens." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every sound made my heart pound. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks. I started thinking maybe it had been a one-time thing, a random break-in. Maybe the person who did it had moved on. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. And I was right. The next time, it was worse. I woke up to find my closet door open. Just a little, just enough to make my breath catch. I always kept it closed. Always. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone. But before I could call anyone, I saw it. Another note. This one was inside my closet, sitting on top of my folded clothes. It said, "I like watching you sleep." I felt sick. My skin crawled, my stomach twisted. Someone had been in my room. Someone had stood there, inches from my bed, watching me as I slept. I left my apartment that morning. I didn't go to work. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. My mind was racing. What was I supposed to do? Where was I supposed to go? The police hadn't believed me the first time. Would they believe me now? I went to a friend's house. I didn't tell them everything, just that I was feeling uneasy, that I needed to crash somewhere for a while. They didn't ask questions. I stayed there for a few nights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. That no matter where I went, whoever he was, would find me. I was right. The final note came 3 nights later. I had just gotten back from work, still staying at my friend's place, but I had stopped by my apartment to grab a few things. I wasn't planning to stay long, just in and out. But when I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, like someone had been there. And then I saw it. The note was on my pillow, neat, waiting. My heart pounded as I picked it up. My fingers trembled. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know what it said, but I had to. It said, "You can't hide." That was it. Just 3 words, but they shattered any illusion I had of escaping. He had found me. He had been in my home again. He knew where I was staying. He was watching. I left everything behind that night. I packed a bag and drove. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just left. I stayed in a motel hours away, watching the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the night. I changed my number. I deleted my social media. I started over. It's been months now. Sometimes I almost convince myself it's over, that maybe he got bored, maybe he moved on. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I never stopped listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. Because deep down, I know the truth. He's still out there, and he's still watching. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. It was a long weekend, and I wanted to escape the noise of the city. I chose a remote trail in a national park that wasn't too popular, hoping to experience some real solitude. I packed everything: extra water, food, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and even a flare gun. I wasn't going to take any chances. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sun filtered through the trees, and the trail was well maintained. I made good time, covering miles without any issues. I didn't see another soul. It was exactly what I wanted, just me and the wilderness. That night, I set up camp near a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and I cooked a quick meal before settling into my tent. The forest was alive with sounds: chirping insects, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept well. The second day, I planned to hike deeper into the wilderness, to a spot I had marked on my map. It was a clearing with a great view of the valley. The hike started fine, but as I moved further from the main trail, things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The birds had stopped singing. The insects weren't buzzing. It was just me, my footsteps, and the occasional crack of twigs under my boots. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Then I found the footprints. They were fresh, deep, and much larger than mine. I wasn't alone. My stomach nodded. I hadn't seen anyone since I started, and this far into the woods, I wasn't expecting to. The tracks weren't hiking boots, they were bigger, wider, like someone was walking barefoot. And there was something else. The stride was off. Too long, too uneven. I told myself to keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. As I moved forward, I kept checking my surroundings. The trees were dense, making it easy for someone to stay hidden. Every time I stopped, I felt like I heard something behind me, a soft crunch of leaves, a snap of a branch. I turned quickly each time, but nothing was there. By midday, I reached the clearing. It should have felt rewarding, but I couldn't relax. The valley stretched below, untouched wilderness for miles. But I kept looking back at the trail, scanning the trees. I had planned to stay here for an hour, eat lunch, and take in the view. Instead, I ate fast, barely tasting my food, and decided to move on. That's when I saw it. A figure deep in the woods, standing between the trees. Far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I didn't want to run. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. I shouldered my pack and started walking back toward the main trail, keeping my pace steady. The figure didn't follow. At least not that I could see. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there. Watching, I hiked faster than I ever had in my life. Every step felt like I was being hunted. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone, something bursting out of the trees, but nothing came, just the endless silence of the woods. By the time I reached my original campsite, it was late afternoon. I had two choices: stay the night or keep moving. I was exhausted, but the idea of sleeping out here, knowing something or someone was nearby, made my skin crawl. I decided to push forward. Dusk settled in as I made my way down the trail. Shadows stretched between the trees, and my flashlight cast long, eerie beams across the path. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like breathing on my neck. Then I heard it. Not behind me, not in the trees, but ahead. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I stopped cold. The sound was coming from just beyond the bend in the trail. My mouth went dry. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to run. But where would I go? I was miles from my car, and the thought of spending another night in the woods made my stomach churn. I forced myself to move forward, slowly, carefully. As I rounded the bend, my flashlight caught something on the trail. My breath hitched. A single barefoot footprint, fresh, right in the middle of the path. I snapped my head up, scanning the darkness ahead, but there was nothing, just the trees and the void beyond my flashlight's reach. I moved faster now, nearly jogging. The sound of my footsteps filled the empty woods, masking whatever else might be out there. My legs burned, my heart pounded, but I didn't stop. Then I smelled it, a thick, coppery scent, like blood. It was strong, clinging to the air. My stomach churned. I didn't want to know where it was coming from. I didn't want to see what was ahead, but I had no choice. I turned a corner and nearly tripped over it. A deer. Its body was torn open, fresh blood pooling into the dirt. But it wasn't just killed. Something had cut it open deliberately. The clean slices on its belly told me this wasn't the work of an animal. My vision blurred with panic. I staggered backward, scanning the darkness. Someone had done this. Someone was here. Then I heard the breathing. Not mine, not an animal's. Heavy, ragged, close. I bolted. Branches whipped my arms and face as I sprinted down the trail. My pack slammed against my back, slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop to take it off. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed, until I saw the parking lot. My car was there, right where I left it. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The moment I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. My headlights flooded the trailhead, illuminating nothing but trees. But as I put the car in drive, I saw it. a figure at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Watching, I didn't stop. I didn't think. I floored the gas and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't sleep that night. Even when I got home, I felt like I wasn't alone, like something had followed me, like something was still watching. I haven't gone hiking since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. It was a long weekend, and I wanted to escape the noise of the city. I chose a remote trail in a national park that wasn't too popular, hoping to experience some real solitude. I packed everything: extra water, food, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and even a flare gun. I wasn't going to take any chances. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sun filtered through the trees, and the trail was well maintained. I made good time, covering miles without any issues. I didn't see another soul. It was exactly what I wanted, just me and the wilderness. That night, I set up camp near a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and I cooked a quick meal before settling into my tent. The forest was alive with sounds: chirping insects, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept well. The second day, I planned to hike deeper into the wilderness, to a spot I had marked on my map. It was a clearing with a great view of the valley. The hike started fine, but as I moved further from the main trail, things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The birds had stopped singing. The insects weren't buzzing. It was just me, my footsteps, and the occasional crack of twigs under my boots. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Then I found the footprints. They were fresh, deep, and much larger than mine. I wasn't alone. My stomach nodded. I hadn't seen anyone since I started, and this far into the woods, I wasn't expecting to. The tracks weren't hiking boots, they were bigger, wider, like someone was walking barefoot. And there was something else. The stride was off. Too long, too uneven. I told myself to keep going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. As I moved forward, I kept checking my surroundings. The trees were dense, making it easy for someone to stay hidden. Every time I stopped, I felt like I heard something behind me, a soft crunch of leaves, a snap of a branch. I turned quickly each time, but nothing was there. By midday, I reached the clearing. It should have felt rewarding, but I couldn't relax. The valley stretched below, untouched wilderness for miles. But I kept looking back at the trail, scanning the trees. I had planned to stay here for an hour, eat lunch, and take in the view. Instead, I ate fast, barely tasting my food, and decided to move on. That's when I saw it. A figure deep in the woods, standing between the trees. Far enough that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I didn't want to run. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. I shouldered my pack and started walking back toward the main trail, keeping my pace steady. The figure didn't follow, at least not that I could see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there. Watching, I hiked faster than I ever had in my life. Every step felt like I was being hunted. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone, something bursting out of the trees, but nothing came, just the endless silence of the woods. By the time I reached my original campsite, it was late afternoon. I had two choices: stay the night or keep moving. I was exhausted, but the idea of sleeping out here, knowing something or someone was nearby, made my skin crawl. I decided to push forward. Dusk settled in as I made my way down the trail. Shadows stretched between the trees, and my flashlight cast long, eerie beams across the path. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like breathing on my neck. Then I heard it, not behind me, not in the trees, but ahead, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I stopped cold. The sound was coming from just beyond the bend in the trail. My mouth went dry. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to run. But where would I go? I was miles from my car, and the thought of spending another night in the woods made my stomach churn. I forced myself to move forward, slowly, carefully. As I rounded the bend, my flashlight caught something on the trail. My breath hitched. A single barefoot footprint, fresh, right in the middle of the path. I snapped my head up, scanning the darkness ahead, but there was nothing, just the trees and the void beyond my flashlight's reach. I moved faster now, nearly jogging. The sound of my footsteps filled the empty woods, masking whatever else might be out there. My legs burned, my heart pounded, but I didn't stop. Then I smelled it, a thick, coppery scent, like blood. It was strong, clinging to the air. My stomach churned. I didn't want to know where it was coming from. I didn't want to see what was ahead, but I had no choice. I turned a corner and nearly tripped over it. A deer. Its body was torn open, fresh blood pooling into the dirt. But it wasn't just killed. Something had cut it open deliberately. The clean slices on its belly told me this wasn't the work of an animal. My vision blurred with panic. I staggered backward, scanning the darkness. Someone had done this. Someone was here. Then I heard the breathing. Not mine, not an animal's. Heavy, ragged, close. I bolted. Branches whipped my arms and face as I sprinted down the trail. My pack slammed against my back, slowing me down, but I didn't dare stop to take it off. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed, until I saw the parking lot. My car was there, right where I left it. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The moment I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. My headlights flooded the trailhead, illuminating nothing but trees. But as I put the car in drive, I saw it, a figure at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Watching, I didn't stop. I didn't think. I floored the gas and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't sleep that night. Even when I got home, I felt like I wasn't alone, like something had followed me, like something was still watching. I haven't gone hiking since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail was a lesser-known one deep in the Rockies, isolated and tough, but the views at the summit were supposed to be incredible. I had checked the weather, packed extra food and water, and brought all the gear I needed. I was ready. The morning started off well. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up better than any cup of coffee. The sky was a pale blue with no signs of bad weather. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot near the trailhead, making sure to lock everything up before setting out. The first few miles were steady. The trail wound through thick pine forests, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling the air. Birds chirped somewhere overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. I was alone, but I didn't mind. Solitude was part of the reason I enjoyed these hikes. About 5 miles in, the trail became more rugged. The trees grew denser, the ground rockier. I had to watch my step carefully, making sure not to twist an ankle on loose stones. I noticed that the sounds of birds had disappeared. There was only the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dirt beneath my boots. I shook it off and kept going. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A small thing, really. A broken branch hanging at an odd angle, as if something had snapped it recently. Then I saw a torn piece of fabric caught in some thorns. Dark, like from a jacket. It looked fresh. Maybe another hiker had come through earlier, but I hadn't seen a single soul all day. I kept moving, but something in the back of my mind felt off. At around the 8-mile mark, the forest thinned out, giving way to an open stretch of land covered in tall, golden grass. The path cut straight through it, leading toward the mountain range ahead. I took a moment to drink some water and check my map. I was making good time. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were ahead of me on the trail, deep and fresh. Someone else had been here not long ago. I looked around, scanning the area, but there was no one in sight. I had a strange feeling in my gut, but I told myself it was fine. This was a hiking trail after all. It wasn't unusual for someone else to be out here. I pressed on. As I climbed higher, the terrain became more difficult. Loose gravel made every step uncertain, and the wind picked up, howling through the cliffs. I glanced back over my shoulder every now and then, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures, just empty land stretching behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I stopped for lunch. I found a good spot near a large boulder, sat down, and took out my sandwich. I was mid-bite when I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth. My ears strained to pick up another sound, but there was nothing, just silence. I turned my head slowly, scanning the area. Nothing moved. Maybe it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but something inside me wasn't convinced. I packed up my food and kept moving. As I climbed higher, the sense of being watched became stronger. I couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything, but the feeling was there. My body knew it before my mind did. My instincts screamed at me, but I didn't know what they were warning me about. Then I saw the second sign. Another piece of fabric caught on a jagged rock, fluttering in the wind. This one was different, though. It had a dark stain on it. Blood. It was dried, but not old. My stomach clenched. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had fallen, cut themselves, and kept moving. But then why hadn't I seen anyone? The trail led up through a narrow canyon, the walls pressing in on either side. It was the kind of place where sound echoed strangely. My own footsteps sounded doubled, like someone else was walking just behind me. I stopped. Silence. I took another step. Another step echoed back. My throat went dry. I turned quickly, scanning the canyon behind me. Nothing, just the empty trail. But I knew someone was there. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. I needed to get to the summit. I needed to get out of this canyon and into the open. Then I saw it. A backpack, torn, half buried in the dirt. One strap was missing, and the fabric was slashed open. I hesitated for only a second before crouching down to look at it. There was no ID, no sign of who it belonged to, but there was something inside. A crumpled note, the paper smeared with dirt, and something darker. 2 words were scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. Not alone. A chill ran through me. I stood up, my hands shaking. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run. But I was deep in the mountains. I was miles from my truck. If I panicked, I'd only make things worse. I forced myself to move, walking fast but steady. My breathing was loud in my ears. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved. A figure, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. I stopped. They didn't move. I couldn't tell if they were facing me or not, but something about their posture, the way they stood so still, it wasn't normal. Then, without warning, they took a step toward me. My legs moved before my brain could process it. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it back down the trail. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. I reached my truck as the sun was setting, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of that lot so fast I nearly lost control. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported what I saw. I wouldn't have even known what to say. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that note. About the torn backpack. About the footprints that weren't mine. And I know, deep down, that whoever wrote it, they never made it back. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, clear my head, and enjoy the quiet of nature. I picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from any marked trails. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the remoteness, or maybe it was just my nerves. Either way, I brushed it off and focused on getting to my destination before dark. The drive was long and bumpy. My old truck rattled over the dirt road as I left civilization behind. The trees grew denser the farther I went, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. I had studied the map carefully. No cell service this deep in the woods, so I had to rely on my navigation skills. I parked the truck on a patch of flat ground near a small clearing. The plan was simple: hike in a few miles, set up camp near the river, and spend the next couple of days fishing and enjoying the solitude. I double-checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, rifle, extra batteries for my flashlight. Everything was in order. I locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves and chirping of birds. It was peaceful. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot near the river. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth stones. I set down my pack and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up quickly, and I gathered some wood for a fire. As the last bit of daylight faded, I lit the fire and sat back, listening to the crackling flames and the distant hoot of an owl. Everything felt normal, comfortable. I cooked a simple meal, enjoyed the warmth of the fire, and eventually crawled into my tent. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of insects and night creatures, but it was nothing unusual. I fell asleep easily. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe just instinct, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting faint orange light against the walls of my tent. The usual sounds of the forest were still there, but beneath them was something else, something faint, a sound I couldn't place. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The cold air rushed in as I stepped out. The forest seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, scanning the trees, the bushes, the riverbank. And then I saw it. Footprints. In the dirt. Fresh. They weren't mine. They were large, booted prints, deeper than mine, as if the person was heavier. I crouched down, following them with my flashlight. They came from the direction of the trees, circled my campsite once, then stopped a few feet from my tent before turning back the way they came. Someone had been here, watching me. I stood up, heart pounding. I scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. The thought of someone standing out there, hidden just beyond my vision, sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my rifle and checked the chamber, loaded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came slow. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. This trip was over. I wasn't about to stay another night knowing someone had been creeping around my tent. I hiked back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest, once peaceful, now felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The birds were quiet. The air felt heavier. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. When I finally reached my truck, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I tossed my gear in the back, unlocked the door, and froze. The driver's side door was already unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. My stomach dropped as I yanked the door open and checked inside. Nothing looked disturbed. The keys were still in my pocket, right where I left them. But someone had been here. Had they been watching me hike back? Waiting for me to return? I didn't waste another second. I started the truck, threw it into reverse, and got the hell out of there. The drive back felt like it took forever. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the road behind me, watching me leave. I never found out who it was, never found out what they wanted. I just know that I'll never camp alone again. I never liked being alone in the woods. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an uneasiness that crawled beneath my skin, whispering that I didn't belong there. Still, when my old friend offered me his cabin for a few days, tucked deep in the mountains, far from the noise of the city, I couldn't refuse. I needed the break. I needed the quiet. The drive was long, the last 30 miles on a narrow dirt road, winding higher through dense forest. My tires skidded on loose gravel a few times, but eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat alone, framed by towering trees. It looked old but sturdy, built from thick logs with a slanted tin roof. Smoke still curled from the chimney, a sign that my friend had left the fire burning for me. That was nice of him. I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff legs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a crispness that cut through my lungs. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. No cars, no people, just silence. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The cabin was simple. One large room with a bed pushed against the far wall, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. A single door led to a tiny bathroom. I set my bag down near the bed and checked my phone. No service. Not unexpected. My friend had warned me about that. "It'll be good for you," he'd said. A chance to disconnect. I wasn't so sure. The first night was quiet. I made dinner, canned soup heated over the gas stove, and read a book by lantern light. Outside, the trees swayed, their branches scratching against the roof. Occasionally, I'd hear something moving in the underbrush, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to ignore it. I wasn't used to the sounds of the wild, but I reminded myself that I was the intruder here. This was their home, not mine. I fell asleep easily, but sometime in the middle of the night, something woke me. A sound soft, deliberate, a creaking floorboard. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light across the room. I strained my ears. Nothing, just the wind. Maybe I'd imagined it. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next day, I explored a bit. There was a small river a short walk from the cabin, its water clear and ice cold. I followed a narrow trail along the bank, finding old footprints in the mud. Human footprints, probably my friends, though they looked fresh. I hadn't seen any other cars on the way up, and this was private land. It had to be his. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the day chopping wood, stacking it near the door. By evening, my muscles ached, but the work felt good. I made dinner, read more of my book, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That night, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was inside the cabin. A slow, deliberate scrape against the floor. I didn't move. My body locked up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the bed. I listened, barely breathing. Another sound, something shifting, just beyond the glow of the dying fire. I reached under the bed, fingers closing around the handle of the hatchet I'd brought inside earlier. I waited. Minutes passed. The room was deathly silent. I counted in my head. 1 minute, 2, 3. I didn't move. Eventually, my arm began to ache from gripping the hatchet so hard. Nothing happened. Slowly, I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The fire had dimmed even further, but I could make out the shapes of the furniture. The door was still locked, the windows shut, but something felt wrong. I stood, moving cautiously, stepping over to the lantern on the counter. I turned it on, the soft glow filling the room. Empty. I checked the door. Locked. The windows, also locked. The floor near the wood stove had a long, thin scratch across it, a fresh mark in the dust. I barely slept the rest of the night. Morning came, gray and cold. I went outside, searching for tracks, but found nothing, just the trees and the wind. I told myself I was imagining things. Isolation can play tricks on the mind. I needed to relax. That evening, I built the fire high, determined to keep the cabin warm and well lit. I read, made dinner, tried to act normal, but I kept glancing at the door, at the windows. I kept thinking about that sound. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Then, deep in the night, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak. Closer this time. I sat up fast, gripping the hatchet, my pulse roaring in my ears. The fire had burned low again, casting long shadows. The sound had come from the far corner of the room, near the woodpile. I turned on the lantern, my breath shaking. Nothing. but the pile of wood had shifted. Someone had been inside. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and without hesitation, I unlocked the door and stepped into the freezing night. My car was parked just outside, my breath clouding in the air. I forced myself to stay calm as I unlocked it, throwing my bag into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life. Headlights cut through the trees, illuminating nothing but the dirt road ahead. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I drove straight down that winding road, tires kicking up gravel, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. A few days later, my friend called. He sounded confused. "You left early?" "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a lower voice, he asked, "Did something happen?" I almost told him. I almost said what I'd heard, what I'd seen. But then I remembered the fresh footprints by the river, the shifted woodpile, the scratch on the floor. "No," I said. "Nothing happened. I never went back."